When Khalid bin al-Walid executed his legendary desert march to save the Syrian front, the Iraqi theatre was left in a strategic void. The vanguard's kinetic core was gone, and the resurgent Sassanid Persian Empire was waking up to crush what remained. For months, the fate of the Caliphate's eastern frontier rested on the shoulders of one man, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha. This is the unbroken story of his desperate, brutal holding war. Throughout this campaign, we witness the darkest hours and the bloodiest resurrections of the Muslim vanguard. We break down the catastrophic disaster at the Battle of the Bridge, where Sassanid war elephants shattered the Arab lines and pushed the army to the brink of annihilation. And we witness the brutal vengeance at the Battle of Buwaib, where Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha anchored the frontier through pure tactical tenacity. But a guerrilla holding action could not stop an awakened empire. As the Sassanid Emperor Yazdegerd III mobilized a massive state-level extermination force under his supreme commander, Rostam Farrokhzad, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha succumbed to his battle wounds. The crisis reached Medina. Caliph Umar bin al-Khattab understood the arithmetic of the moment. He issued an emergency decree of total mobilization, calling every tribe, veteran and swordsman across Arabia to the banners. To lead this newly forged state army, Umar bin al-Khattab appointed Saad ibn Abi Waqqas, tasking him with the unyielding administrative discipline required to face the Persian war machine. This is the complete, feature-length chronicle of Persian campaign. From the desperate survival of Al-Muthanna bin Haritha's vanguard to Umar bin al-Khattab's massive mobilization, culminating in the 4-day, earth-shattering Battle of Al-Qadisiyyah. The banners are raised. The complete strategic breakdown begins right now. Before we proceed, a massive salute to our commanders and elite guards over on Patreon. Your support keeps this channel strong. If you'd like to join the ranks and support us, the link is in the description. And to all our new viewers, welcome aboard. Don't forget to hit subscribe and like the video. It's the best way to help the YouTube algorithm recognize our work and keep this community growing. The sands of El-Iraq were silent. For over a year, the ancient frontier of the Sassanid Persian Empire had been battered by a relentless, unstoppable storm. The Sassanid provincial armies had been systematically dismantled, their aristocratic generals struck down in single combat, and their heavily fortified cities along the banks of the Furat had capitulated one by one. The architect of this absolute devastation was a man the Persians had come to view not as a mortal general, but as a supernatural nightmare. But then, in the spring of 634 AD, the nightmare inexplicably vanished. Following a strict, desperate decree from Caliph Abu Bakr, the supreme commander, Khalid ibn al-Walid had turned his warhorse west. He had taken half of the army, roughly the most seasoned, most battle-hardened corps of veterans, the absolute spearhead of the Islamic military, and plunged into the depths of the Syrian desert to reinforce the hard-pressed Muslim armies in Sham. He left behind the conquered plains of El-Iraq. He left behind a wounded, deeply humiliated Sassanid superpower that had lost battle after battle and city after city to a people they had always regarded as desert rabble. And he left behind a power vacuum of terrifying proportions. Standing in the swirling dust, watching the black banners of the vanguard disappear into the western heat haze, was a man who now inherited the most dangerous military command on the face of the earth. His name was Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha. Al-Muthanna was not a Qurayshi aristocrat from El-Medina or Makkah. He was a hardened, grizzled Bedouin chieftain from the tribe of Banu Shayban, a powerful branch of the great Banu Bakr confederation. He was a master of frontier warfare, a man who had been raiding Persian border territories long before the Caliphate had ever formally mobilized its armies. He had been the one who had walked into the court of Abu Bakr years earlier, laid out the strategic vulnerabilities of the Sassanid frontier with cold precision, and essentially lit the fuse that started the entire Iraqi campaign. He was ferociously brave, unyielding, and commanded the absolute respect of his men. But as the dust settled over the forward camp, the grim mathematical reality of his tactical situation became agonizingly clear. Khalid ibn al-Walid had not just taken experienced men, he had stripped the army of its elite core. The highly disciplined mobile guard, the heavy cavalry, the veteran champions who had survived the meat grinder of the Ridda Wars, they were gone. Al-Muthanna was left with a dangerously reduced force. This remaining army was heavily reliant on newer Bedouin recruits and local allied tribes who lacked the iron discipline of the departing veterans. With this fractured army, Al-Muthanna was expected to hold the entirety of the newly conquered Iraqi frontier. He was holding a porous, indefensible line that stretched for hundreds of miles against a wounded 400-year-old empire. And the empire was watching. Less than 50 miles away, across the intricate river networks, the capital of the Sassanid Empire, Ctesiphon, was seething with political chaos and military paranoia. The Persian court had been severely fractured by years of internal assassinations and civil war. The throne itself had changed hands multiple times in a matter of years, leaving the empire administratively fractured and psychologically raw. But their intelligence network remained highly effective. Sassanid scouts embedded in the agricultural zones quickly confirmed that the Muslim encampments had drastically shrunk. The terrifying formations of Rashidun heavy cavalry were absent. The undefeated commander was nowhere to be seen. When the Persian High Command confirmed that Khalid ibn al-Walid had completely abandoned the theatre, a wave of ferocious, vengeful relief swept through the vast halls of the imperial court. The young emperor, Yazdegerd III, had only recently consolidated his grip on a throne made slippery by decades of blood and conspiracy. He was desperate to demonstrate imperial strength, to prove that the Sassanid war machine was not broken, and to erase the humiliating memory of the past year with a decisive, overwhelming counterstroke. To the Persian nobility, this was not merely a temporary reprieve, it was a golden, undeniable tactical window. The desert raiders who had humiliated their provincial governors had made what appeared to be a fatal miscalculation. They had divided their forces, stretched their logistics to the breaking point, and left their eastern flank exposed. The Persians resolved to strike immediately. They would crush the remaining Muslim force, reclaim the rich agricultural lands of the Furat, and demonstrate to every client tribe and provincial governor that the King of Kings still commanded the most powerful war machine on earth. The Persian High Command authorized an immediate, overwhelming counter-offensive. They appointed a veteran, aristocratic general named Hormuzd, known in Persian records as Hormuzd Jadhuyi, to lead the vanguard of the retaliation. This was no longer a disorganized border defense composed of local militias and hastily assembled provincial levies. Hormuzd marched out toward the contested frontier with a heavily armored, highly organized Sassanid imperial strike force. His army was terrifyingly equipped: thick-scaled cataphracts, disciplined professional infantry, and the psychological crown jewel of Sassanid warfare: war elephants. Living, breathing, heavily armored siege engines that the remaining Muslim recruits had never faced in open combat. To a soldier who had only ever fought on foot or horseback, a charging war elephant was not merely a weapon. It was a nightmare made flesh. As the massive Sassanid column moved south, the earth trembling beneath the weight of their iron, their supply carts, and their beasts, deep penetration Muslim scouts frantically rode into the camp of Al-Muthanna, delivering the intelligence. The Persians were coming. They were moving with the unstoppable momentum of pure imperial vengeance, and they vastly outnumbered the believers. For a lesser commander, the response would have been predictable. dig in behind the walls of Al-Hira, wait, pray for reinforcements, or worse, send desperate word to Al-Madinah and do nothing while the Persians closed the distance. But Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha possessed the cold, brutally calculating mind of an apex predator who had spent his entire life fighting on this frontier. He had watched the Persians operate for years. He knew their doctrine, he knew their strengths, and he knew, with absolute precision, where their weaknesses lived. He also possessed something far more important than military theory. He possessed initiative. Al-Muthanna looked at his officers. He did not call a council of the hesitant. He did not wait for the Persians to choose the ground and the moment of engagement. A commander who surrenders initiative surrenders everything that follows. He issued his orders with the calm authority of a man who had already calculated the outcome 3 moves ahead. He was going to march his army out of Al-Hira, cross the Frat, and carry the fight directly to the Persians. He would not allow Hormuz to march all the way to Al-Hira, set up on ground of his own choosing, and deploy his cataphracts and war elephants on the vast, perfectly flat agricultural plains where every single Sassanid tactical advantage would operate at maximum lethality. The open plains were the killing ground of the Sassanid heavy cavalry. Al-Muthanna was not going to hand that killing ground to his enemy. Instead, he would choose the battlefield himself, and he already knew exactly where. The ancient ruins of Babylon lay a determined march to the north, on the opposite bank of the Frat. This was where Sassanid intelligence reported Hormuz was consolidating his forces. This was where the Persian vanguard was encamping, preparing to finish their march south and crush the depleted Muslim army. This was where Al-Muthanna was going to meet them, not in a panicked defensive crouch, but in a deliberate, calculated offensive strike. His officers loaded the camp, his men crossed the Frat, and the army of Islam marched north toward one of the most ancient and storied cities the world had ever produced, to fight a battle that would define whether the Muslim presence in Iraq survived or died. The ruins of Babylon were a landscape that whispered of collapsed empires and broken emperors. The massive ziggurat mounds rose from the earth like the fists of buried giants. The ancient irrigation canals, long since emptied, cut through the earth in deep, treacherous channels. Collapsed brick walls, walls that had once defined the greatest city in the known world, jutted from the ground at savage, irregular angles, creating a topographical labyrinth of shadow and debris that stretched for miles in every direction. Al-Muthanna surveyed this landscape with the eye of a man who had spent his life reading terrain. He positioned his army deliberately and with precision. He used the ancient walls as natural anchors for his flanks, ensuring the Persians could not simply sweep around his lines with their superior cavalry. He placed his archers on the high mounds of rubble where they would have plunging fire over the flat approach ground. He kept his most aggressive riders in reserve, ready for the decisive moment when the Persian formation fractured. Hormuz, for his part, did not flinch when he received word that the Muslim army had crossed the Euphrates and was marching directly toward him. In truth, the Persian general had expected the Muslims to cower behind the walls of Al-Hira and await the inevitable siege. The audacity of Al-Muthanna's advance struck his aristocratic certainty not with caution, but with contempt. These were desert tribesmen marching toward the finest professional army in the world. He deployed his forces in the classical Sassanid battle formation, cataphracts anchoring the wings, heavy infantry holding the center, and the war elephant positioned at the vanguard to lead the assault and shatter whatever thin Muslim line attempted to hold against him. Both sides exchanged messages before the battle. The sources record that they sent letters threatening one another with destruction, a practice that was as much psychological warfare as ritual. Hormuz wanted the Muslims to feel the weight of what they were marching into. Al-Muthanna's response, in the tradition of the Bedouin commander, was the same answer his people had always given to imperial ultimatums. He answered with his army. The Battle of Babylon erupted under the vast, pale sky of the Iraqi plain, in the long shadows of the ancient, crumbling ziggurats. Hermes ordered the war elephant forward first. This was doctrine. This was the Sassanid answer to any enemy whose cavalry could not be trusted to hold in the face of a conventional charge. Send the elephant, break their nerve, collapse their formation before a sword has been drawn. And for a terrible, suspended moment, it worked. The elephant advanced across the broken ground, its iron-shod feet shaking the earth, its armored howdah bristling with archers, its great bulk a moving fortress that drew the eye of every Muslim soldier on the field. The newer recruits, men who had never stood in a battle line against anything larger than a horse, felt something ancient and primal surge through them. Paralysis. The particular kind of paralysis that touches a man when his rational mind tells him to hold and his body begins, very quietly, to negotiate with his feet. But Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha had calculated for exactly this moment. He had known the elephant would come. He had known what it would do to the hearts of his men, and he had already decided what he was going to do about it. He did not send an order. He did not gesture to an archer company or dispatch a lieutenant with instructions. He gathered a handful of his most trusted warriors, men of Banu Shayban, who had ridden with him for years, who knew the rhythm of his command before he spoke it, and he rode directly toward the advancing elephant himself. What happened next would be told and retold across the Islamic world for generations. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, the commander of the entire Iraqi front, charged the war elephant personally. He rode at the beast with his companions in a lightning attack, striking from close quarters with a ferocity the elephant's handlers could not have anticipated or adequately defended against. The assault was not suicidal bravery. It was surgical violence, executed by men who had spent their lives learning exactly how to move and strike in the chaos of close combat. The elephant, struck, wounded, maddened, staggered. It groaned, its enormous legs buckled, and then, in full view of both armies, it fell. The silence that followed lasted less than a heartbeat. Then the Muslim ranks erupted. With the fall of the elephant, the psychological architecture of the Persian assault collapsed. The beast had been the terror at the tip of their spear, the weapon designed to make the enemy's discipline dissolve before the real fighting began. Instead, it was the Sassanid formation that lost its cohesion. Hermes drove his infantry forward into the gap, desperate to salvage the momentum, but the moment had passed. The Muslims, electrified by what their commander had just done, by the sheer, undeniable proof that a man with enough nerve could bring down any weapon, no matter how colossal, came forward to meet the Persian advance with absolute, ferocious conviction. The battle became a brutal, grinding, close-quarters fight across the broken terrain of ancient Babylon. The Sassanid heavy infantry found their rigid phalanx formation constantly interrupted by the cratered ground, the jagged canal trenches, and the shattered foundations of the ancient city. The Muslim light fighters, wearing little more than chainmail and moving with the fluid speed of men born to desert combat, turned every fractured piece of ground into an advantage. They struck and withdrew. They drew Persian units forward into dead ends between collapsed walls, then hit them from three sides simultaneously. Hermes fought at the center of it, as a Persian general of his rank was expected to do. He was not a man who commanded from the rear. He died as a result. He fell on the battlefield of Babylon. The sources are direct on this point. The Persian general who had marched out of Ctesiphon to erase the humiliation of the past year, who had been given an imperial mandate to destroy Al-Muthanna's army and reclaim the Euphrates, did not survive the engagement he had been so confident of winning. He died in the rubble of the most ancient city in the world, and with his death, the last coherence of the Sassanid vanguard came apart entirely. The Persian army broke. What had been a professional imperial formation dissolved into a retreat, and the retreat became a rout. The soldiers who had marched south from Ctesiphon with the full weight of imperial authority behind them turned and ran north, back toward the safety of the Persian capital. The great counter-offensive, the golden tactical window that Yazdegerd III's court had seized upon with such certainty, ended with their commander dead in the dust and their vanguard scattered across the banks of the Furat. Al-Muthanna held the field of Babylon. The Muslims had won. But as the deafening roar of battle faded into the groans of the wounded and the silence of the fallen, Al-Muthanna did not celebrate. He did not permit his men to lower their guard or surrender to the euphoria of victory. He possessed a cold, terrifying grip on strategic reality, and that reality was as clear to him now as it had been before the battle began. He had defeated the vanguard. He had killed the general. He had broken the first wave. But Ctesiphon had not sent everything it had. The Persian Empire that had ruled this land for 400 years was not going to look at the body of Hormuz, process the loss of a skirmish, and quietly accept the new order of the world. Yazdegerd III would be enraged. He would be humiliated. And an enraged, humiliated emperor with the full resources of a still functioning superpower at his disposal was not finished. He was only beginning. Al-Muthanna counted his forces. He counted his losses. He considered the arithmetic honestly, the way only a man who has actually commanded in battle can do, without illusion, without the comfortable narratives that soft men build around inconvenient numbers. His army had won. His army had also been bled, and the force that had won at Babylon was not large enough to hold El-Iraq against what Ctesiphon would send next. He needed reinforcements. Not requests for reinforcements, urgent, undeniable, non-negotiable reinforcements. The kind that only a caliph could authorize and only an entire mobilization could provide. He turned to his most trusted, most resilient riders. He gave them the finest Arabian horses in the camp and sent them west with orders that amounted to a simple, brutal truth. Ride to Al-Madinah and tell the caliph that the battle has been won and the war is not over, and that without fresh men, the army of Islam in Iraq will eventually be ground down and destroyed. They rode with terrifying velocity through the desert, pushing themselves and their mounts to the absolute physical breaking point, knowing that every hour they delayed brought the next Persian response one step closer to the frontier. They crossed hundreds of miles of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. They rode through the scorching day and the freezing night, eating in the saddle, sleeping in shifts, changing horses where they could, and pressing on where they could not. And when the exhausted, dust-covered riders finally passed through the gates of Al-Madinah and saw the silhouette of the Prophet's mosque rising against the sky, they were met with a reality more terrible than any Sassanid army. They did not find a capital sharpening its swords and forging its armor. They did not hear the sounds of an empire preparing for war. They found a city in the grip of profound and suffocating grief. The beloved Caliph, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, was dying. The illness had taken hold quickly and mercilessly, the way illness always comes for the men who have given everything and left nothing in reserve for themselves. This was the man who had held the fractured Arabian Peninsula together through the fires of the Ridda Wars, the man who had possessed the absolute audacity to simultaneously challenge the Roman and Persian empires when every calculation of military logic said such a thing was impossible. The man who had been the closest companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first to believe and the last to despair. He was confined to a simple, unadorned bed, his body failing, his breathing labored, but his mind still entirely anchored to the world he was fighting to preserve. The riders from Al-Iraq were brought before him. They delivered Al-Muthanna's dispatch, the victory at Babylon, the death of Hormuz, the routing of the Sassanid vanguard, and the iron-hard truth beneath all of it, that the army which had won was not large enough to win indefinitely. and that the empire they had just struck would not stay struck. Abu Bakr heard every word. Then, with the measured deliberateness of a man who had learned that grief and duty occupy the same breath, he turned to the man he had designated as his successor. The stern, towering, uncompromising Umar ibn al-Khattab stood at his side. "O Umar," the dying Caliph said, his voice weakened by illness, but carrying the absolute authority of a man who had never confused urgency with panic. "Do not allow any calamity, however great, to distract you from the defense of the believers. When I am gone, let not grief delay what must be done. Al-Muthanna and his men have served their faith with everything they possess. Ensure that they do not stand alone." Shortly after delivering this command, the first Caliph of Islam closed his eyes and was gone. The grief that washed over Al-Madinah was overwhelming and total. Men who had survived the Battle of Badr wept openly in the streets. Women recited Quran in low, continuous voices that drifted through the city like smoke. The weight of the loss was not merely personal, it was civilizational. Abu Bakr had been the hinge upon which the entire project of the early caliphate had turned. Without him, the question of what came next felt, for one terrible, suspended moment, genuinely unanswerable. But the brutal, unforgiving machinery of geopolitics does not pause for mourning. Ctesiphon was not weeping. Yazdegerd III, burning with the humiliation of Babylon and the loss of Hermes, was already ordering fresh levies. The mantle of leadership passed instantly to Umar ibn al-Khattab. He was a man of terrifying physical presence, unmatched intensity, and unyielding justice. A man whose very appearance commanded silence in a room, and whose decisions, once made, were not revisited. He did not permit himself or the capital to dissolve into paralysis. He honored Abu Bakr's memory the only way Abu Bakr would have wanted it honored, by acting. The very morning after assuming the caliphate, Umar stood before the believers in the Prophet's mosque and delivered a call to arms. He spoke of Al-Muthanna. He spoke of the victory at Babylon, of the courage that had brought it about, and of the reality that courage without numbers eventually runs out. He called upon the men of al-Madinah and the surrounding tribes to ride to El-Iraq, to stand beside their brothers on the eastern frontier, and to carry the weight of the campaign that Khalid ibn al-Walid had left behind. He was met with a silence so heavy it had physical weight. It was not cowardice, or at least it was not only cowardice. It was something older and deeper than that. For centuries, the Arabs had lived in the long shadow of Persia. The Sassanid Empire had been the permanent, immovable geological fact of the Eastern world, the way mountains are facts, not challenges to be overcome, but realities to be navigated around. Yes, Al-Muthanna had won at Babylon. Yes, Khalid ibn al-Walid had humiliated Persian armies up and down the El-Farat before that. But Khalid was gone, and the men standing in that courtyard in El-Madinah knew, with the bone-deep certainty of people who had grown up hearing stories of Sassanid cataphracts and war elephants, that marching to Iraq without the sword of Allah was a different proposition entirely from marching with him. The hesitation was real. It hung in the air like the moment before thunder. Then a single man stood up. His name was Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi. He was not a famous senior companion from the Battle of Badr. He was not a high-ranking Qurayshi aristocrat. He was a warrior from the tribe of Thaqif, from the city of Taif, a man whose reputation rested entirely on the evidence of his own behavior rather than the prestige of his lineage. "I will go," Abu Ubaid declared, and his voice cut through the paralyzed silence of the courtyard like a blade through cloth. There is a particular quality of courage that is contagious in a way that mere bravery is not. Bravery is a man doing a terrifying thing alone. Contagious courage is a man doing a terrifying thing first, so that the men beside him suddenly discover they were capable of it all along. Abu Ubaid's declaration broke something open in the courtyard of the mosque. A ripple went through the crowd. Hundreds, Then thousands of veterans from El-Madinah and the surrounding tribal territories began to stand, pledging their swords and their lives to the Iraqi front. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab successfully assembled a fresh, motivated strike force in the days that followed. But as the army prepared to march, a critical question of command arose. There were highly decorated senior companions of the Prophet within the ranks, men of immense historical prestige, veterans of the earliest and most dangerous campaigns of Islam. Traditional Arab hierarchy dictated that command should pass to the most senior among them. But Umar possessed a radically different metric for leadership, and he was not a man who allowed convention to override judgment. He walked past the senior companions. He took the command banner and placed it directly in the hands of Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi. When questioned by the elders, and they did question him because this was Umar ibn al-Khattab, and questioning him required real nerve, the Caliph replied with the cold clarity that defined everything he did. "I will appoint over you the first to respond when his brothers needed him. The honor of precedence in faith belongs to the companions, but the command of an army belongs to the man who steps forward when others calculate the cost." The decree was absolute. The banner passed to Abu Ubaid, and with it, the weight of the entire Iraqi campaign rested on the shoulders of a man from a Taif who had simply been the first to stand up. He was a commander forged of raw aggression. He did not intend to march to El-Iraq to settle into a cautious defensive holding pattern alongside Al-Muthanna. He did not intend to consolidate the existing positions and wait for the Persians to show him what they were planning. He had no interest in the measured, patient calculus of asymmetrical warfare that had kept Al-Muthanna's smaller force alive after Babylon. Abu Ubaid was going to take the war directly to the Sassanid Empire. He was going to cross the Euphrates, penetrate deep into Persian-held territory, and strike at the very heart of what the Sassanids had assumed would be their permanent sanctuary. Al-Muthanna, for his part, had seen the intelligence reports. He had read the terrain. He had spent years learning the particular geography of the Sassanid military mind. He would urge caution. He would counsel against crossing the river on Persian terms, against accepting battle in the deep interior where every logistical and positional advantage belonged to Ctesiphon. His advice was the product of hard experience, of campaigns that had taught him the difference between audacity and recklessness in the specific lethal context of this frontier. Abu Ubaid would not listen. As the new vanguard marched out of the gates of El-Madinah, raising a massive cloud of dust against the rising sun, Abu Ubaid looked east with the absolute certainty of a man who had never yet been wrong. The long, unforgiving march out of El-Madinah was not a parade of triumph. It was a march into the absolute, terrifying unknown. At the head of the vanguard rode Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi. He carried the primary command banner of the caliphate, entrusted to him by the stern and uncompromising Umar ibn al-Khattab. But with that banner came a crushing psychological weight. He was marching his men into a landscape where the greatest empires on earth collided, stepping directly into the power vacuum left behind by the undefeated Khalid ibn al-Walid. He had left El-Madinah with roughly 1,000 men from his own tribe of Thaqif. The number swelled as tribal contingents joined the column on the march north, but he was still leading an army of thousands against an empire of millions. They were marching toward the blood-soaked plains of Iraq, toward a Sassanid war machine that had been badly bruised at Babylon and was now seething with imperial fury and the cold, calculating rage of Rostam Farrokhzad, the supreme military mind of Ctesiphon. After weeks of blistering, relentless desert marching, the fresh vanguard finally crested the horizon and descended into the arid borderlands of Iraq. There, holding the absolute fringes of the desert, clinging to the edge of the wilderness like wolves at the boundary of a forest, they found the battered, exhausted remnants of the Iraqi army. At their head stood Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha. The contrast between the two commanders was profound and immediate. Abu Ubaid was a weapon of raw, unadulterated momentum. He was fresh, fiercely aggressive, and burning with the desire to prove his appointment. Al-Muthanna was a grizzled, scarred veteran of asymmetrical frontier warfare. He had spent years studying the Sassanid military doctrine. He knew the taste of the Euphrates mud and the particular stomach-hollowing sound of a charging Persian cataphract. He had personally brought down a war elephant at Babylon with his own hands. Military history is littered with the corpses of armies destroyed by the clash of egos between rival commanders. Traditional Arab hierarchy would suggest that Al-Muthanna, who had bled for this land and kept the Eastern Front alive after Khalid's departure, might resent taking orders from a man whose only claim to supreme command was that he had stood up first in the Mosque of El-Medina. But the Islamic army of the 7th century did not operate on the fragile calculus of aristocratic ego. When Abu Ubaid rode into the camp, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha did not hesitate. He did not challenge the decree. The seasoned desert warlord walked forward and seamlessly, unconditionally, submitted to the command of Abu Ubaid. There was no friction. There was no debate over precedence or prestige. Al-Muthanna simply fell into rank, recognizing that the banner carried the authority of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. This flawless display of military discipline fused the fresh Thaqifi reinforcements and the battle-hardened veterans into a single lethal force. And Abu Ubaid intended to use that force immediately. Across the river networks, deep within the heavily guarded walls of Ctesiphon, Sassanid intelligence delivered the chilling news. The desert warriors had not been permanently broken. Fresh banners had arrived from the deep desert, and the Muslim army was not retreating. It was moving forward. The Persian high command was jolted from its brief, bitter complacency. Rostam Farrokhzad, the most formidable military mind the Sassanid Empire possessed in its twilight years, was not a man who made panic-driven decisions. He assessed the reports from his scouts with the detached, clinical precision of a chess master studying a board. He realized that the Muslim revival could not be suppressed by another provincial strike force. This was not a border raid. This was the Caliphate making a second, deliberate push into the Iraqi heartland. Rustam ordered the immediate mobilization of a massive, coordinated counter-offensive. He sent the Persian general Jaban south with a substantial army, over 15,000 troops, toward Al-Hira, with orders to push the Muslims back and reclaim the Euphrates' western bank. Behind this move, Rustam kept the full weight of the Sassanid imperial corps ready at Ctesiphon, waiting for the right moment to deploy. He had also assembled around him the Armenian prince Jalinus, a highly capable commander who would play a critical role in the campaign to come. When word reached the Muslim camp that Jaban's army was approaching Al-Hira from the north, Al-Muthanna made an immediate, tactically sound decision. He did not attempt to hold Al-Hira against a force twice his strength on open, flat terrain. He fell back west of the Euphrates to a position known as Hafan on the western bank, where the river itself would shield his flank and deny the Persians the ability to outflank him with their heavier cavalry. He waited there for Abu Ubaid to arrive with the Medina reinforcements. When the two armies merged at Hafan, the combined Muslim force reached approximately 15,000 fighters, a force now capable of meeting Jaban on something approaching equal terms. Abu Ubaid organized his command lines. He placed Walid ben Jadara over the cavalry of the right flank and Amru ben Haytham over the left. Al-Muthanna ben Haritha commanded the veteran desert cavalry. Then Abu Ubaid marched north to meet Jaban. The two armies collided at a place called An-Namarik, near what is today the site of Kufa. The Battle of An-Namarik erupted with sudden concentrated violence. The Persians were arrayed in their standard heavy formations, deep shields, long spears, elite cavalry anchoring the wings, and Jaban was fully confident in the crushing weight of the Sassanid battle line. What he did not fully account for was the particular lethal combination he was facing. He was fighting the cold, veteran discipline of Al-Muthanna's desert warriors, fused with the burning, unyielding aggression of Abu Ubaid's Thaqifi vanguard in a single formation. Abu Ubaid drove the Muslim center forward with ferocious, suffocating pressure, while Al-Muthanna's cavalry worked the flanks with the fluid, constant harassment that had always been the Banu Shayban's signature. The Persians fought hard, but the Muslim assault simply did not stop. There was no hesitation, no pause for breath, no moment where the Persian line could reset. Under the relentless pressure, the Sassanid formation buckled. Jaban was captured in the chaos that followed the Persian rout. But Jaban was not a man who accepted captivity. The sources record simply that he was captured but freed himself by a trick, offering hostages and his word as guarantees before slipping away from the Muslim camp. Whether through deception, bribery, or exploiting the chaos of a victorious army celebrating its triumph, Jaban disappeared, later rejoining the Persian ranks. The victory at An-Namariq was decisive and real, but the Persian general who had commanded the enemy escaped to fight another day, which would matter more than the Muslims realized in the weeks ahead. Abu Ubaid pressed his advantage immediately. He did not settle into An-Namariq. He did not spend days consolidating. He was intoxicated by the first clean victory, and he already knew his next objective. The town of Kaska and the broader district beyond the Euphrates represented the next major Sassanid presence in the region. Rostam, receiving the news of An-Namariq, had moved quickly to establish a fresh Persian force under the general Nursi in this territory to stabilize the Sassanid position and create a new defensive anchor. Nursi was no provincial administrator. He was a capable, aristocratic military commander from the ranks of the Persian nobility, tasked with holding the district and buying Rostam time to fully mobilize the main imperial army. But once again, Abu Ubaid outpaced the Persian response. He marched his army north and east toward Kaska at a speed the Sassanids did not expect, crossing the river and striking before Nursi could consolidate his defenses. The Battle of Kaska, a sharp, decisive engagement, ended with Nursi defeated and the Persian force driven out of the district. The Muslim army marched into the abandoned camps and found, as they had so often on this campaign, the staggering contrast between Sassanid imperial wealth and the simple, hardened lives of the desert warriors. Silk pavilions, chests of silver, the elaborate, aromatic foods of a royal court, sitting beside the coarse leather saddlebags of men who had lived on dates and water for weeks. But the victory at Kaska was not clean in the way An-Namariq had been. Nursi retreated with his force largely intact, and word came swiftly through the Muslim scouts that the entire calculus of the Iraqi campaign had just fundamentally shifted. Rostam had stopped sending provincial armies. He was now preparing to commit the full, mechanized core of the Sassanid imperial military, equipped with the war elephants, the elite Jayadan heavy cavalry, and the colossal Sassanid armies that had broken Roman legions from Egypt to Anatolia. Abu Ubaid pulled his forces back across the Euphrates toward the western bank near what would later be called the site of Kufa. He had won 2 battles in rapid succession. He had pushed deeper into Sassanid territory than any Muslim commander since Khalid ibn al-Walid. The spoils of Kaska were real and substantial. He separated the Caliph's fifth and dispatched it under heavy guard back across the desert toward El-Medina, fulfilling the strict administrative duties of his command. When the caravans reached the capital, the site of the Sassanid royal treasures, sent a wave of relief and pride through the city. Abu Ubaid had vindicated the Caliph's decision. He was hailed as a conqueror. In the space of weeks, the Thaqafi commander had resurrected the Iraqi front. But within the command tent on the banks of the Furat, one man remained entirely immune to the euphoria. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha watched the celebrations with a cold, growing unease that had nothing to do with false modesty and everything to do with a decade of hard knowledge about the specific terrain they were standing on and the specific enemy they were facing. He was a creature of this frontier. He had fought the Persians long enough to understand the fatal difference between defeating a provincial field army and provoking the full mechanized core of the empire into motion. He saw the dangerous psychological shift taking root in the mind of his supreme commander. Abu Ubaid was beginning to view the Sassanid military as fundamentally fragile. He had fought them on open ground and on crossed rivers, and he had won both times. The consecutive victories had forged an armor of absolute confidence in his mind. But Al-Muthanna knew what was coming. Rostam Farrokhzad had finished his analysis. He had examined the reports from An-Namariq and Kaskar with the cold, methodical patience of a man who had commanded armies for decades. He concluded that the Thaqafi commander could not be destroyed in the field by conventional means. Abu Ubaid was too aggressive, too fast, and too willing to accept casualties to be broken by a standard frontal engagement. To destroy a predator fueled entirely by forward momentum, you do not build a wall in front of it. You open a door. You invite it into terrain where its speed becomes its executioner, and where its one fatal weakness, its refusal to ever consider retreat, becomes a death sentence. Rustam selected his instrument with the precision of a man who understood that this battle would shape the future of the war itself. He appointed the veteran commander Bahman Jadhawi to lead the main imperial strike force, a man whose name already carried weight on the Iraqi frontier. Years earlier, during the Walaja campaign, Bahman had been ordered west to join the effort against Khalid bin Walid. But before he could fully engage, the crisis unfolding in Ctesiphon forced the Sassanid high command to recall him. The empire had been too unstable to commit everything to the frontier war. Now the political chaos had eased, and Bahman was being sent back to confront the same expanding Arab threat he believed should have been crushed years before. Among the Arab soldiers, he was known as Zu al-Hajib, the man with the heavy brows. He was not a reckless cavalry hero nor a court noble chasing glory. He was an aging professional of the old Sassanid military order, methodical, disciplined, patient, and deeply contemptuous of the Arab armies that had spent the last two. Rustam also positioned the Armenian prince Jalinus alongside Bahman as a senior commander, ensuring the force had both experience and depth of command. Rustam gave Bahman something else, something that had never appeared in the provincial counter-offensives, the border skirmishes, or even the campaigns of Hormuz. He unlocked the deepest vaults of the imperial treasury and handed Bahman the Derafsh Kaviani, the legendary royal war standard of the Sassanid Empire, encrusted with jewels and gold, generations old, brought onto the battlefield only when the empire itself was at stake. Every Persian soldier who saw it understood exactly what it meant. This was not a punitive expedition. This was not a border skirmish. This was the empire fighting for its life. Bahman marched this colossal force, the full weight of the Sassanid imperial corps, with war elephants, elite heavy infantry, Jayadan cavalry, and the legendary standard flying above them, out of Al-Madain and toward the Euphrates. But following Rustam's strict tactical blueprint, he did not cross the river to engage the Muslims on the western bank, where the desert was at their backs and retreat remained an option. Instead, he halted his massive, terrifying army on the eastern bank, directly opposite the Muslim camp. He arrayed his forces where the Muslims could see every elephant, every banner, the distant gleam of the Darash Kaviani itself catching the light. Then Bahman executed his psychological masterstroke. He sent no attack. He sent no arrows. He sent a single envoy across the river in a small boat. The envoy walked into the camp of Abu Ubaid Thaqafi and delivered, with cold, aristocratic deliberateness, a choice dressed up as a question. Our commander asks, "Will you cross to us, or shall we cross to you?" The question was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. It was framed not as a military matter, but as a test of nerve. It was designed to make a tactical decision, whether to fight on the western bank with an open desert behind you, or on the eastern bank with an unfordable river behind you, feel like a test of courage rather than a question of survival. To say, "Cross to us," was the tactically correct answer. It was also the answer that could be painted as cowardice, as waiting, as flinching in the face of Persian iron. The blood rose in the face of Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi. He had just crushed the army of Jaban at An-Namarek. He had just defeated Nursi at Kasakar. He was the sword of the Caliph on the eastern front. The idea of sitting on the western bank while the Persians stood a river's width away and questioned his courage was to the core of his identity an intolerable, obliterating insult. "We will cross to you," Abu Ubaid declared. The words fell from his mouth before the full tactical weight of them had time to settle. Panic seized the command tent the moment the envoy departed. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha stepped forward immediately, shattering the formal hierarchy of the command council, his voice carrying the desperate urgency of a man watching a catastrophe assemble itself in real time. "Oh, Abu Ubaid, do not do this." Al-Muthanna's voice was not the voice of a frightened man. It was the voice of someone who has seen this particular mistake kill armies before. "Do not cross the river to them. Tell them to cross to us. If they cross to us, they will have the river at their backs, and we will have the open desert at ours. If they press us, we can maneuver. We can fall back into the desert, where their elephants and heavy cavalry cannot follow. But if you cross to them, you put the river at your back. There is no desert behind you. There is no space to maneuver. If the lines break, the only direction is the water." Salit ibn Qais, whom Umar himself had appointed as advisor to Abu Ubaid, echoed al-Muthanna's plea. Other veteran commanders who had fought under Khalid ibn al-Walid added their voices. The argument was not tactical timidity. It was a flawless, cold assessment of military geometry. The river crossing put the entire army into a box. Once across, the Euphrates was not a shield, it was a cage. But the armor of unbroken victory around the mind of Abu Ubaid had become something else entirely. It was no longer confidence. It had curdled into a brittle, absolute pride that could not tolerate the sound of reasonable caution without hearing it as cowardice. He turned to Al-Muthanna, the man who had personally killed a war elephant at Babylon, the man who had kept the Iraqi front alive through sheer tactical brilliance and personal courage, the man whose judgment had been forged in years of blood on this exact frontier, and he stripped him of command of the cavalry. In his place, Abu Ubaid appoints another commander to lead the horse. It was one of the most consequential personnel decisions in the history of the early caliphate. In a single, pride-driven act, Abu Ubaid had removed the single most experienced, most tactically literate commander in the entire Muslim army from the role where his expertise would matter most. "The Persians cannot be more daring than us in seeking death," Abu Ubaid declared, and his voice carried the absolute, final finality of a man who has already made his decision and is done listening. "We will cross." The argument was over. The decree of the supreme commander was law. Al-Muthanna lowered his head. He stared at the dark, rushing surface of the El-Farat. A man who had spent his entire military life reading terrain and enemies, reading the moment before disaster, knew with absolute, cold, unarguable certainty what the water in front of him was about to become. Finally, the orders were carried down the chain of command with the mechanical, indifferent efficiency of a military machine obeying its commander. Men assembled boats. Thick ropes were lashed across the current. A narrow, swaying pontoon bridge was constructed across the river, creaking and shifting in the current, just wide enough for men to cross in column. On the morning of the 28th of November, 634 CE, the Muslim army began to march across the bridge, single file, in column, into the narrow pocket on the eastern bank where Bahmanjar the Way was already waiting. The Darafsh Kaviani burning above his lines, the war elephants ranked and ready, the elite cataphracts coiled at his flanks. The unfordable, deep, lethal water of the Euphrates directly behind the men crossing. On the opposite bank, hidden behind the immovable wall of Sassanid iron and the massive, waiting silhouettes of the war elephants, Bahmanjar the Way, the old man with the heavy brows, watched the Muslim army cross the bridge. The trap was closed, the door was open, and the nightmare at the bridge was about to begin. To understand the catastrophe that would unfold on the banks of the Euphrates in the autumn of 634 AD, you must first understand the man who was never supposed to be there. The Muslim campaign in Iraq had not begun as a conquest of empire. It had begun as a survival strategy. From the moment the tribes of Arabia rose in apostasy during the Ridda Wars, the new caliphate under Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had discovered a brutal truth. The momentum of unity had to be directed outward, or it would consume itself inward. The Iraqi frontier, the crumbling western edge of the Sassanid Persian Empire, became the pressure valve. The men who first carried Islam across the Euphrates were not soldiers of a structured imperial army. They were raiders and survivors, tribal warlords who had spent their entire lives reading desert terrain the way scholars read scripture. None understood this more completely than Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, the chieftain of the Banu Shayban. He had been the architect of the early frontier campaign, fluid, patient, always refusing to be drawn into a set-piece engagement where Persian armor and numbers would be decisive. He had not won every engagement, but he had kept his army alive, and that was something. By the spring of 634 AD, Al-Muthanna had achieved something extraordinary against the greatest military machine in the known world. He had held a frontier, he had raided deep into Sassanid territory, and he had sent urgent word back to Medina. To press the advantage, he needed reinforcements, veteran fighters and a recognized commander who carried the full political authority of the Caliph. What he received was not quite what he had requested. In El-Medina, the second Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, faced a political reality that geography could not solve. The Muslim army in Iraq was at a crossroads. It needed to escalate or it would stagnate. But the frontier veterans, Al-Muthanna's men, were almost entirely from specific Arabian tribes who had their own internal hierarchies, their own pride, their own complicated loyalties. Umar needed someone who would unify this fractious command structure under a single banner recognized by all. Someone whose appointment would signal to both the army and to the Sassanid court that the caliphate was escalating with intent. He chose Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi, a man of unquestionable personal courage, a sincere Muslim and a tribal leader of the Thaqif, who had volunteered himself and his men with genuine fervor. He was not the most experienced frontier commander. He had not studied the peculiar, maddening tactical geometry of the Iraqi floodplain. But his volunteer spirit and his tribal standing made him the caliph's choice. And so, Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi was given supreme command of the reinforced Iraqi army. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, the man who had built that army with his own hands and scars, was quietly stepped down from supreme command. Abu Ubaid led his reinforced columns out of the Arabian desert and into the Iraqi lowlands with extraordinary aggression. He had something to prove, and the early results seemed to validate the Caliph's faith. At An-Namarik, he met a Sassanid provincial force and shattered it before the Persians could establish a defensive line. At Kaska, he repeated the performance, a surgical strike that dismantled what remained of the regional garrison command. The Sassanid high command in Ctesiphon was forced to acknowledge that this new Muslim army was not conducting a raid. It was conducting a systematic campaign, and that is precisely where the first fault line began to open. Every victory Abu Ubaid won reinforced a certainty that was, in fact, a dangerous illusion. He had beaten border forces, provincial defenders. He had not yet encountered the imperial corps, the massive, professionalized war machine that the Sassanid Empire could mobilize when it decided to commit. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha knew the difference. He had spent years learning the precise moment when the Persians shifted from reactive defense to offensive obliteration. And as the army approached the Euphrates in the weeks before the confrontation at the bridge, he pulled Abu Ubaid aside. The conversation, preserved in fragments in the chronicles of At-Taberi, was blunt. "Do not cross the river to meet them," Al-Muthanna is reported to have urged. "Keep the water at your front, not at your back. Draw them across to us. Let the desert fight for us as it always has. If we lose on the open plain of Arabia, we can retreat, regroup, and return. If we lose on the eastern bank of the Euphrates, we lose everything. There is nowhere left to go." Abu Ubaid heard the counsel, and he rejected it. In his mind, and perhaps in the minds of his Thaqafi officers, who burned with the desire to match the glory of the Syrian campaigns, being fought simultaneously by Khalid ibn al-Walid, retreating to the western bank while the Sassanid army waited on the eastern shore, carried an unbearable implication. It looked like fear, and Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi would not be recorded by history as the man who flinched. He gave the order to cross. The morning of the 26th of Shaban, in the 13th year of the Hijra, what we record as approximately late November, 634 AD, broke over El Farat with a heavy, unnatural silence. The swaying pontoon bridge, a fragile lifeline of timber and rope, groaned under the weight of the Rashidun vanguard. Thousands of men from the tribes of Thaqif, Bajila, and the volunteers of El-Medina marched in tight columns across the rushing water. They were walking out of the vast, open sanctuary of the Arabian desert and stepping directly into a suffocating, narrow pocket of mud and reeds on the eastern bank. Look at the geography of this battlefield, and you understand immediately why it was a trap. The Euphrates behind them was unfordable, deep, fast and violent, with seasonal current. The terrain to the north and south was broken marsh and reed bed, channeling any movement strictly forward or backward. There was no flank. There was no space to execute the oblique cavalry charges that had made the early Arab frontier raiders so dangerous. The geometry of the ground had pre-decided the tactical options before a single sword was drawn. Abu Ubaid had transformed a fluid, asymmetrical war into a brutal, symmetrical test of raw mass, and in that test, the Sassanid Empire held every advantage. On the opposite side of the narrow battlefield, the Sassanid imperial commander, Bahman Jadhwiyah, waited. He had been dispatched from Ctesiphon with explicit orders from the imperial high command to end the Muslim incursion permanently. And Bahman Jadhwiyah, a veteran of the empire's brutal eastern frontier wars, was a man of clinical, geometric patience. He did not rush. He did not send his archers forward to harass the Arabs while they were still crossing the bridge and at their most vulnerable. He waited. He allowed the trap to fill completely. The intelligence reaching Ctesiphon had been consistent. The Muslims were tactically brilliant in fluid engagements and psychologically devastating in raids. But they were not a mass army. They did not have the institutional depth of a professional imperial military. Their horses were fast but unarmored. They had no siege tradition. And critically, they had no experience whatsoever with the weapon that Bahman Jadhwiyah was now positioning at the center of his battle line. As the last of the Muslim vanguard stepped off the bridge and onto the eastern bank, and as Abu Ubaid's officers began shouting men into formation, the morning mist over the Mesopotamian plain slowly dissolved, and the true, terrifying scale of what Rostam Farrokhzad had authorized from Ctesiphon finally revealed itself to the Muslim soldiers standing in the mud. This was not a border defense force. This was not a provincial garrison. Arrayed before them in rigid geometric discipline was an impenetrable wall of Sassanid heavy infantry, the famous Piada, armored chest to ankle, their massive rectangular shields interlocked edge to edge, forming a continuous iron barrier. Above the shields, a forest of long infantry spears bristled at an upward angle, catching the weak winter sun. On the flanks, the Azerbaijani mounted archers were already moving to envelope positions, and behind the cavalry, motionless and silent in their terrifying completeness, stood the Zhaidan heavy cataphracts, the immortal core of the Sassanid professional army, each rider armored in overlapping iron scales, their horses barded in the same material. And then the sound came. Deep, rhythmic, seismic, a sound that had no equivalent in Arabia, the war drums of the elephant corps. They emerged from the morning shadow of the Persian formation like moving fortresses. Colossal war elephants, their flanks armored in heavy leather and chainmail, their heads covered in iron plates, their enormous tusks wrapped and protected. Atop each animal sat a wooden howdah, a fighting platform packed with trained Sassanid archers and javelin men, firing from an elevation no cavalry charge could reach. The beasts numbered dozens, and leading them, positioned at the center of the Persian vanguard, was the largest of them all. An enormous white elephant, the prestige animal of the imperial command structure, beneath which flew the Darafsh Kaviani, the ancient, jewel-encrusted royal battle standard of the Sassanid Empire. Its presence carried a specific message that every soldier on both sides understood. The King of Kings had authorized a war of absolute annihilation. There would be no negotiated withdrawal. There would be no mercy. The tension snapped. Bahman Jadhwiyah raised his signal, and the Sassanid line began to move. Slowly at first, the grinding mechanical advance of a force that had no need to hurry, because the mathematics of the battlefield had already decided the outcome. The elephant corps lurched forward, driving the interlocked shield wall ahead of them, the combined weight of beast, men and iron creating a physical pressure wave that the Muslim vanguard could feel through the soles of their feet. The Muslim cavalry rode out to intercept. These were Arabian war horses, among the finest light cavalry animals in the world. They were faster than anything the Persians had on the field. In the open desert, they would have ridden circles around the lumbering elephant corps, striking from angles and withdrawing before the Sassanid line could respond. But they were not in the open desert. They were in a box, and they were riding towards something their nervous systems had never encountered. The scent hit them first, a massive, overwhelming animal musk that had no parallel in the Arabian Peninsula. Then the sound, the deep, resonant trumpeting of dozens of war elephants building toward a charge, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Then the sight, these moving walls of iron and flesh and wood, towering over everything, pressing forward with a terrible inevitability. The Arabian horses broke, not from cowardice, from pure, hardwired biological panic. Horses that had never encountered an elephant cannot be trained in a single morning to override that terror. The cavalry formation fractured violently. Horses reared and threw their riders. Horses refused to advance and turned, crashing back into the Muslim infantry that was still forming behind them. The cavalry, the arm of maneuver that might have bought time or created gaps in the Persian line, ceased to function as a military instrument in the opening minutes of the battle. Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi, saw it all happen from the center of his dissolving formation. He saw the cavalry break. He saw the Sassanid iron wall continuing its advance without pause. He understood, in that moment of horrible clarity, the full and total weight of Al-Muthanna's warning, the warning he had refused. The river was at his back, the flanks were impassable, the cavalry was gone. There was no tactical maneuver available to him. None. A lesser commander might have ordered a fighting retreat to the bridge at that moment. It would have been the militarily rational decision. It would have preserved a majority of his force. Abu Ubaid was not interested in the rational decision. He dismounted from his horse. He drew his sword. He turned to the men of Thaqif standing closest to him, men from his own tribe, men whose fathers and uncles he knew by name, and he roared at them. The Persians cannot be more daring than us in seeking death. He charged, on foot, directly at the center of the Sassanid elephant formation. It was an act of staggering, suicidal bravery that achieved something that cavalry could not. The Arabian infantry, running low and fast, could duck under the swinging range of the elephant's tusks, could dodge the trunks, could press into the dead ground directly beneath the animals' bodies, where the howdah archers above could not depress their aim far enough to engage. Abu Ubaid led his men into that impossible space, hacking furiously at the leather girth straps that secured the fighting platforms to the elephants' backs, driving short blades into the soft flesh behind the knees of the animals, trying through sheer frantic violence to neutralize the weapon that had broken his cavalry. For several breathless minutes, the Thaqafi assault genuinely stalled the Persian center. The elephant handlers struggled to control animals that now had dozens of screaming, cutting men beneath them. The howdah archers could not fire down into the tangle without risk of hitting their own animals. A gap opened in the shield wall behind the elephants, where the infantry had been disrupted by the sudden, unexpected close-quarters press. It was a moment of genuine tactical opportunity. It was also the last one. The great white elephant at the center of the Persian line had not panicked. Its handlers were among the most experienced in the Sassanid corps, men who had managed these animals through the chaos of a dozen campaigns. The animal was armored, trained, and disciplined. It fixed its attention on the single figure in the churning melee who was visually distinct from the rest, the man holding the supreme banner of the Rashidun Caliphate. Abu Ubaid saw it coming. He swung his sword in a wide, defiant arc and struck the elephant's trunk, a blow that any other opponent would have ended. The white elephant did not stop. It could not be stopped by a sword. The sheer mechanical mass of the animal, thousands of pounds of armored, enraged, living beast, was simply not within the capacity of a single man with a blade to halt. The elephant crushed Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi into the mud of Iraq. The supreme banner of the caliphate fell. The psychological shock of watching their commander die under the elephant's feet rippled through the Muslim ranks like a physical impact. But the men of Thaqif refused, in that first terrible moment, to allow the banner to lie in the mud of a foreign country. Abu Ubaid's kinsman, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, lunged forward into the press of Sassanid shields, grabbed the standard, and threw himself at the Persian line with a grief so raw it had no room for self-preservation. He lasted only minutes. The heavy Sassanid spears found him through a gap in the press, and the banner fell again. Command passed immediately to the next in the tribal hierarchy of Thaqif. He raised the standard and screamed for the vanguard to hold. He too was cut down in the shadows of the continuing elephant advance. The chroniclers of this battle, most thoroughly at-Tabari, writing 2 centuries later from the accounts of the survivors and their descendants, record that the banner of the caliphate passed through the hands of 7 successive commanders from the tribe of Thaqif in that chaotic, desperate hour. 7 men who stepped forward, knowing with absolute certainty what had just happened to the man who had held it before them. 7 men who stepped forward anyway. They were all killed. Consider what this means tactically. The command structure of the entire Iraqi campaign was being decapitated in real time, in full view of both armies. Every Thaqafi officer who died not only removed another experienced leader from the equation, it sent a visible, devastating signal to every other Muslim soldier on the field. The Sassanid war machine was not just killing men, it was killing the army's ability to think, to react, to adapt. With the 7th Thaqafi commander dead, with the Elephant advance continuing its relentless push, and with the rearmost elements of the Muslim formation already pressing against the steep embankments of the Euphrates, the coherent defense finally fractured into panic. Men who had marched out of El-Medina with the absolute certainty of God's favor now turned from the Persian iron and looked behind them at the narrow, swaying wooden bridge. And they moved toward it. It was at this exact moment that Abdullah ibn Marthad, a soldier of Thaqif, made the decision that transformed a military defeat into a catastrophe. His intentions, as the chronicles record them, were not cowardice. They were a form of fanatical, inverted courage. Watching his brothers turn toward the bridge, he concluded, with the desperate logic of a man who had seen his commander die and his army dissolving, that the only way to prevent the retreat was to make retreat impossible. He would force his brothers to turn and fight to the death by removing the route of escape. He fought his way to the bridge's anchor point on the eastern bank. He raised his sword, and he hacked through the heavy ropes lashing the pontoon boats to the shore. The bridge groaned, shifted, and then, in a series of violent, splintering lurches, it broke apart. The loose boats were swept immediately into the rushing current of the Euphrates, spinning and tumbling downstream, the severed ropes trailing behind them in the dark water. The eastern anchor point was gone. The bridge was gone. The only exit from the battlefield had been removed by a Muslim soldier, and the Sassanid army was still advancing. What Abdullah ibn Marthad had intended as a desperate rallying act instead produced the precise outcome it was meant to prevent. The retreat did not transform into a defiant final stand. It transformed into a blind stampede. Men who had been retreating in some semblance of order now found themselves at the edge of an unfordable river with nowhere to go, pushed from behind by the mechanical inevitability of the Sassanid advance, crushed forward by the weight of their own collapsing ranks. They went into the river, hundreds of them, men wearing the iron ringmail and heavy leather armor of the period, carrying shields, swords, spears, armor and weapons that are perfectly designed for land combat and perfectly catastrophic for buoyancy. The Euphrates was not a gentle ford. It was a deep, powerful, fast-moving river, swollen with seasonal flow. The men who entered it in panic did not swim. They drowned. They dragged each other beneath the surface in the dark, suffocating rush of the water, each man's grip on the next man pulling them both under. The current moved the bodies downstream with terrible efficiency. Above the drowning men, the Sassanid archers, firing from the elevated howdahs of the war elephants, still had clear sightlines to the chaos on the riverbank. They poured a continuous, unhurried rain of heavy arrows into the mass of men trapped between the water and the Persian iron. It was no longer a battle. It was a systematic execution of a trapped force, conducted with the dispassionate professionalism of an imperial military that had done this before to other armies, on other frontiers, in other centuries. It was in this exact moment of total civilizational catastrophe, with the banner of the Caliphate lying somewhere in the mud, with the army dissolving into the river, with the Sassanid iron advancing without pause, that Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha stepped back into the center of military history. Understand what kind of man this required him to be. He had been removed from supreme command. He had watched the army he built handed to another man. He had seen his counsel refused at the precise moment it would have saved every life now being lost. He had every moral justification to stand at the bridge's western anchor and watch the disaster that his warning had predicted unfold. every justification except one. He was Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, and he did not leave men to die if there was anything left in his body that could prevent it. Screaming over the deafening roar of the slaughter, Al-Muthanna rallied the core of his Banu Shayban veterans, the men who had been with him since before Abu Ubaid's arrival, the battle-hardened frontier fighters who knew his voice and his authority as viscerally as they knew their own heartbeats. He spurred his horse directly into the suffocating press of retreating men, not to retreat with them, but to stop them, physically inserting himself and his veterans as a barrier between the fleeing mass and the pursuing Sassanid forward elements. He formed a rear guard, in the middle of a rout, under elephant charges, under constant arrow fire. He planted his banner and his best men in the ground between the river and the Persian advance, and he held that ground with the methodical, experienced ferocity of a man who had spent his entire life fighting exactly this kind of impossible rear action. He absorbed the brunt of the Sassanid pursuit. He took the arrows and the spear charges that would otherwise have hit the men in the water. He bought seconds, and seconds in a rout are the difference between a catastrophe and an extinction. While the rear guard bled, Al-Muthanna was simultaneously screaming orders toward the river. Engineers, rope handlers, anyone who could swim. He needed the bridge repaired, or enough of it improvised to give surviving men a passage back across the Euphrates. Men threw themselves into the freezing, blood-stained water, diving to retrieve severed rope ends, wrestling with the current to drag floating timbers back toward the bank, working under a continuing storm of Persian arrows because Al-Muthanna was screaming at them, and because Al-Muthanna did not scream at men to do things he would not do himself. The repairs were hasty. The repaired bridge would not have passed any structural inspection. It was barely functional, but it held, and across its creaking, groaning, blood-wet planks, the broken surviving fraction of the Rashidan Iraqi army stumbled back to the western bank of the Euphrates, not victorious, not intact, but alive. When the last survivors reached the western bank and Al-Muthanna finally pulled his rear guard back across what remained of the bridge, the scale of what had happened at Ma'arakat al-Jessa began to resolve itself out of the chaos into something quantifiable and terrible. The chroniclers give varying numbers, as they always do for battles of this period. At-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir, working from the accounts of survivors and their descendants, record Muslim losses in the thousands. Some accounts say 4,000 dead, others say more. The dead included Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi himself, the supreme commander. They included 7 commanders of Thaqif, who had each taken the banner in succession. They included an entire generation of the Thaqafi tribal fighting force, men whose families back in At-Taif would wait for news that would never come in the form they hoped. Beyond the human cost, consider the strategic consequences. The reinforcement that Umar ibn al-Khattab had sent to stabilize the Iraqi front had been effectively destroyed. The tribal vanguard from Arabia that was supposed to be the caliphate's spearhead in the east had been cut to a fraction of its operational strength. The initiative that Abu Ubaid had seized with his victories at An-Namarik and Kaskar had been violently reversed. The Sassanid Empire, which had been forced onto the defensive in Iraq, had now demonstrated that it could mass its imperial power and obliterate a Muslim field army when given favorable conditions. The news, when it reached Umar ibn al-Khattab in al-Madinah, hit the caliphate like a physical blow. The caliph is reported in the chronicles to have gone into a period of deep grief, not merely for the political setback, but for the men. For Abu Ubaid, who had volunteered with such sincere fervor. For the Thaqafi soldiers who had died holding a banner in a land they had crossed an ocean of desert to reach. And yet, the Sassanid victory at the bridge, for all its tactical completeness, carried within it a strategic contradiction that Bahman Jadweha either did not see or could not address. He had destroyed a Muslim army, but he had not reconquered Arabia. He had not restored Sassanid authority over the territories already taken. He had won a battle on the eastern bank of the Euphrates, and Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha was still standing on the western bank. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha stood alone on the western bank, leaning on a spear that had been through more battles than most men would ever see. Around him, the broken remnant of what had entered that day as a confident Rashidun field army sat in exhausted, shell-shocked silence. Many were wounded, all were shaken. The sun was setting over the Mesopotamian plain, casting long blood-red shadows across the slow water of the Euphrates, and on the far bank, the Sassanid imperial standard still flew, unmoved and immovable, above the bodies of the Muslim dead. The tactical window had slammed shut. The Sassanid counter-offensive had succeeded beyond what Ctesiphon had dared calculate. They had destroyed the reinforcements from El-Medina. They had killed the supreme commander. They had demonstrated to every tribe between Arabia and the Zagros Mountains that the Muslim advance into Iraq was not inevitable, that it could be stopped, reversed, turned into catastrophe. And yet, Al-Muthanna had held the rear guard. Al-Muthanna had repaired the bridge. Al-Muthanna had brought men home alive. And now, standing in the gathering dark, Al-Muthanna was already thinking about what came next. Not out of arrogance, not out of the kind of aggressive certainty that had killed Abu Ubaid, but out of the deep, patient, tactical intelligence of a man who had been studying the Sassanid Empire on this frontier for years. He knew something that Ctesiphon's triumphant commanders did not yet fully appreciate. The Sassanid victory at the bridge had cost them too. The imperial force that had executed the trap could not stay indefinitely in the field. The logistics of maintaining a mass army in the Mesopotamian lowlands were brutal. Winter was coming, and Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha was still there. He sent riders back to El-Medina. His report to Umar ibn al-Khattab did not minimize the catastrophe. It did not excuse the defeat, but it also did not end with despair. It ended with a request: send more men. The frontier had not fallen. The war had not been lost. One battle, even one as devastating as Ma'arakat al-Jessa, did not decide the fate of the Islamic campaign in Iraq. What decided it was who was still standing when the dust cleared. And Al-Muthanna was still standing. The tragedy of the bridge remains, 14 centuries later, a haunting study in the cost of overconfidence, and in the rarer, quieter heroism of a man who knew he had been right and chose anyway to save what could be saved, rather than to say he had told them so. An entire generation of the Thaqafi vanguard was consumed in a single morning. The caliphate stood on the absolute edge of strategic collapse in Iraq, and the river ran dark for days with the weight of what had been lost. But this is not where the story of Iraq ends. It is where it truly begins. The survivors Al-Muthanna brought home from that riverbank would become the institutional memory of how not to fight the Sassanid Empire. And the reinforcements that Umar would send in response to the disaster, battle-tested, tactically educated, burning with something more focused and more dangerous than mere courage, would eventually stand at a place called Al-Buwaib, and the reckoning would come. In our next episode, we witness the calculated, precise vengeance of the Rashidun at the Battle of Buwaib, where Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha would finally turn the tide of the war, and the Sassanid Empire would learn what it costs to corner a desert warlord without finishing him. The Al-Farat does not forget. It carries its dead patiently, silently, down through the floodplains of ancient Babylon, past the reeds that have witnessed the rise and collapse of 100 civilizations. In the year 634 of the Common Era, the 13th year of the Hijra, the great river carried something new on its black currents. It carried the bodies of Muslim soldiers, warriors of faith, men who had marched out of El-Medina with absolute certainty that God Almighty was their shield. They had crossed the bridge at the order of their proud commander, Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi, and the Sassanid Empire had swallowed them whole. Thousands drowned. Thousands more were cut apart by the iron tusks of imperial war elephants. The catastrophe at the Battle of the Bridge was not merely a military defeat. It was a civilizational wound, a rupture in the unbroken confidence that had carried the armies of the early caliphate from victory to victory across 2 continents. But history is not written by those who fall. It is written by those who refuse to stay down. And in the weeks following the disaster, one man, grizzled, unbroken, and utterly immune to despair, was already building the instrument of vengeance. His name was Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha al-Shaybani, and the river was about to remember his name. The morning after the catastrophe at the bridge, the western bank of the Al-Furat was a landscape of raw, unmitigated despair. A freezing desert wind swept down from the north, carrying the scent of blood and Sassanid campfire smoke across the rushes and reeds. The proud, aggressive Thaqafi vanguard was gone, annihilated. Thousands of Muslim soldiers lay dead in the churning currents, their weapons and armor stripped by the victorious imperial forces on the opposite shore. The shattered remnants of the army, bruised, bleeding, and psychologically shattered, were completely paralyzed. The absolute confidence that had carried them out of El-Medina had turned to ash and river mud. Rumors of the terrifying Sassanid war elephants, of the unstoppable imperial shield walls, of the sheer mechanical, industrial weight of Persian military power spread through the broken camp like wildfire. For the first time since the great campaigns of expansion had begun, men who had faced 2 empires without flinching were openly, without shame, discussing the option of abandoning the front entirely and retreating into the deep desert. The historical sources, Ibn Jarir at-Tabari, chief among them, paint a picture of near-total collapse. The psychological damage inflicted at the bridge was, in many ways, more catastrophic than the physical losses. The Muslim forces had lost not just soldiers, but their foundational belief in their own invincibility. And on an open frontier, against the most powerful military machine in the Eastern world, that kind of psychological crack can widen into a chasm that swallows an entire campaign. But in the center of the collapsing camp, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha stood like an immovable iron pillar driven deep into the earth. The grizzled veteran of the Benu Shayban, a man who had spent his entire adult life raiding and surviving on the razor's edge of the El-Iraq frontier, did not allow himself a single moment of visible grief. He understood something that the weeping soldiers around him did not. On this frontier, paralysis was not a luxury. Paralysis was a death sentence. While the remnants wept, Al-Muthanna moved with deliberate, lethal efficiency. He took absolute command of the disintegrated front, deploying his remaining loyal Benu Shayban desert riders along the western banks to prevent Sassanid scouting parties from crossing and catching the Muslim force in its most vulnerable state. His perimeter was thin, dangerously, almost absurdly thin, but it held. At the same time, his personal messengers rode west with terrifying velocity, carrying dispatches that would determine the fate of the entire Iraqi campaign. The message Al-Muthanna sent to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab in El-Medina was remarkable in its brutal honesty. He did not obscure the scale of the disaster. He did not soften the numbers. He laid out a cold, mathematical equation. The vanguard had been annihilated. The frontier was completely exposed. Sassanid intelligence would be reporting to El-Medina within days, and without immediate, massive reinforcements, the entire El-Iraq campaign would be permanently and irrevocably erased from history. When the news of the disaster reached El-Medina, a suffocating silence fell over the capital. The companions of the Prophet who still lived. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had already departed this world, and his successor, Omar, now carried the full weight of the young caliphate on his shoulders, gathered in the mosque with faces carved from stone. The loss was civilizational. The loss was personal. Every tribe in Arabia had sons and brothers and fathers in that drowned army. But Umar ibn al-Khattab was not a man who allowed tragedy to dictate reality. He had built his reputation as caliph not on gentleness, but on a fierce, almost ferocious clarity of purpose. He honored the fallen in the only way that mattered, by acting instantly. The caliph issued a comprehensive mobilization call, and in a move that spoke to both his political genius and his understanding of human nature, he deliberately bypassed the traditional tribal restriction that had always limited campaign forces to veteran, elite contingents. Umar opened the mobilization to every capable fighting man across the Arabian Peninsula. He called upon seasoned companions who had fought at Badr and Uhud. He called upon younger warriors who had never seen a major campaign. Most significantly, and most controversially, he called upon the former members of the Erida tribes, the apostasy rebels who had broken from the caliphate after the Prophet's death and had been brought back into the fold by the campaigns of Abu Bakr's era. These men were given an explicit opportunity. Redeem yourselves on the eastern frontier, or be forever defined by your moment of betrayal. The response was immediate. Across the peninsula, in the mountain villages of the Hejaz, in the deep desert encampments of Najd, in the fertile river valleys of Yemen, men sharpened their blades and saddled their horses. The grief of El Medina was transmuting, as grief sometimes does in extraordinary people, into something harder and colder and more dangerous. Resolve. In the weeks that followed the catastrophe, the fresh relief force began to take shape with remarkable speed. From the rugged, terraced mountains of Asarat in the Hejaz came a formidable contingent of the Azd tribe, hardened mountain warriors who had spent generations fighting in the unforgiving terrain of the Western Peninsula. They were placed under the command of Jarir bin Abd-Illah al-Bajli, a figure of enormous personal charisma and military competence, who would prove his worth many times over in the campaign ahead. Simultaneously, hardened veterans from the tribes of Kenana and An-Nakhar, two of the most battle-tested tribal groups in Arabia, marched toward the frontier in disciplined columns. Smaller contingents came from a dozen other tribal groups, each with their own martial traditions, their own grievances against the Sassanid Empire, and their own reasons for answering the caliph's call. These were not the glory hunters of the original Al-Thaqafi vanguard. These men had been forged by the brutal news from the bridge. They understood, in their bones, what they were marching toward. The historical accounts of At-Tabari and later chroniclers like El-Baladheri and Ibn al-Athir are careful to note the psychological transformation in this new army, where the force that had gathered under Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi had been animated by pride and confidence, both of which had proven fatal at the bridge. This new force was animated by something more durable. It was animated by necessity, by cold, clear-eyed understanding of stakes, by the kind of motivation that does not evaporate the first time an elephant charges. As the fresh columns converged on the western bank of the El-Farat, merging with Al-Muthanna's seasoned desert veterans, the combined force reached approximately 12,000 fighting men, a number that represented nearly the full extent of what the caliphate could mobilize for this front in the short term. Al-Muthanna selected his base of operations with careful veteran judgment. He chose a position called Al-Buwaib, a vital tactical site along a secondary distributing branch of the great El-Farat river system, located approximately in the vicinity of modern El-Kufa in present-day El-Iraq. The choice of Al-Buwaib was not accidental. Al-Muthanna was thinking in three dimensions: tactical, operational, and psychological, simultaneously. The secondary branch at Al-Buwaib was narrower and more manageable than the main El-Farat channel. Any Sassanid force crossing here would be funneled into a predictable landing zone. More critically, al-Buwaib sat at the edge of the desert, which meant that the Muslim forces would have the open wilderness behind them as an infinite sanctuary. If things went badly, they could melt back into terrain that no Sassanid heavy infantry could effectively pursue. But al-Muthanna was not thinking about retreat. He was thinking about where to trap and destroy an imperial army. And al-Buwaib, with the river at the Sassanids' back and the desert at the Muslims' back, was the perfect killing ground, if the tactical choreography was executed correctly. Across the river, in the imperial capital of Ctesiphon, the crown jewel of Sassanid civilization, a city of incomprehensible wealth and architectural grandeur that had stood for centuries, Sassanid intelligence operatives rapidly transmitted the news of the Muslim reinforcement. The reports landed before Rostam Farrokhzad, the supreme commander of the Sassanid military and de facto ruler of the empire during the reign of the young and inexperienced Yazdegerd III. Rustam's reaction was immediate and decisive. The victory at the bridge had been magnificent, but it had clearly failed in its deeper strategic objective of permanently breaking the caliphate's will to fight for the El-Iraq frontier. Instead of retreating in humiliation, as any rational enemy should have done after such a catastrophic loss, the Arab forces had regrouped, reinforced, and were now establishing a new defensive, offensive position. This was, from Rustam's perspective, unacceptable. Rostam mobilized a massive, elite imperial strike force, drawing from the professional core of the Sassanid military, including heavily armored infantry regiments, crack archer battalions, and the terrifying armored cataphract cavalry that were the finest heavy horsemen in the known world. He placed this army under the command of Mehran ben Bardan, a veteran general of immense prestige, whose career had been forged in the brutal, sophisticated wars against Rome on the empire's northern and western frontiers. Mehran was given absolute, unconditional orders. March south from Ctesiphon, cross the El-Farat at the secondary branch near al-Buwaib, and systematically and permanently annihilate al-Muthanna's rebuilt force. There was to be no second bridge. There was to be no escape route left open. The desert warriors were to be exterminated on the western bank and the frontier sealed forever. Mehran ben Bardan marched his massive imperial strike force south from Ctesiphon with the absolute confidence of a man who has never known a campaign that ended in defeat. The Sassanid column moved with the mechanical, grinding precision of a professional imperial army. Supply trains perfectly organized, engineering units prepared for rapid river crossing, cavalry outriders sweeping the flanks for ambushes. When the Sassanid vanguard reached the eastern bank of the secondary branch of the El-Farat, directly opposite the Muslim camp at al-Buwaib, Mehran halted his columns and studied the Arab position with cold, professional contempt. Following the exact same psychological playbook that Bahman Jardawi had deployed with devastating effect at the Battle of the Bridge, Mehran selected a single proud envoy, placed him in a small boat, and sent him across the water to the Muslim command tent. The envoy entered, stood before Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, and delivered the trap with practiced imperial arrogance. "Our commander wishes to know, will you cross the river to us, or shall we have the honor of crossing to you?" The silence in the command tent was heavy. Every officer present knew the history encoded in that question. At the bridge, Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi had chosen to cross, driven by confidence, by tribal honor, by the inability to appear cautious in front of his men. That decision had cost him his life and his army. The question was not merely logistical. It was asking, have you learned anything from your defeat? Or are you still governed by the same tribal pride that destroyed your predecessor? Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha looked the envoy dead in the eye for a long, measured moment. The veteran commander, a man who had spent years reading enemies the way scholars read texts, understood instantly and completely what was happening. This was not a question about logistics. This was a psychological operation designed to replay the conditions of the bridge and produce the same catastrophic result. He delivered his answer with the calm, absolute finality of a man who has already won the tactical argument before the first blade is drawn. "Cross to us," he said. Two words that represented a complete tactical counterstroke of breathtaking elegance. By ordering the Sassanids to cross, Al-Muthanna was executing a reversal of the geometric trap that had destroyed the previous Muslim force. He was refusing, with iron finality, to place an unfordable river at his own back. Instead, he was inviting the Sassanid army to place the river at their backs. He was transforming Buwaib from a potential death trap into an anvil on which he intended to break the imperial hammer. The mathematics were brutally clear. If the battle went badly for the Muslims, the desert was behind them, their natural element, their escape, their sanctuary. If the battle went badly for the Sassanids, the El-Farat was behind them, an obstacle, a killing ground, a watery grave for men in heavy iron armor. Al-Muthanna had seen Sassanid men in full plate try to swim the El-Farat. He knew what happened. He was betting that Mehran did not. The Sassanid High Command accepted the challenge with the absolute contempt of an imperial power that has never doubted its own superiority. Mehran's engineers were already prepared. They had brought their bridging equipment south from Ctesiphon, fully expecting to need it for crossing into Muslim-held territory. Now they deployed it in full view of both armies, lashing their boats together with systematic efficiency, driving stakes into the riverbed, laying planking. In full view of 12,000 Muslim fighters watching from the western bank, the elite Sassanid corps began to tramp heavily across the bridge. The sound was extraordinary, the rhythmic, synchronized crash of iron-shod boots on wooden planking, the clank and jingle of heavy cataphract armor, the creak of the boat bridge under the weight of thousands of heavily armored men. The Sassanid heavy infantry formed up on the western bank with practiced parade ground precision, their long iron spears gleaming under the harsh Iraqi sun, their great shields interlocked in the famous imperial shield wall formation. Behind the infantry came the archers, specialist units, many from the eastern provinces of the empire where archery traditions stretched back to the Parthian era. And behind the archers, crossing last with the ponderous, earth-shaking weight of their armored war horses, came the cataphracts themselves, the heavy cavalry of the Sassanid Empire, each rider encased from helmet to greave in overlapping iron-scale armor, each horse draped in its own armor barding. These were not soldiers, these were mobile fortresses. As the last cataphract unit crossed and the Sassanid army formed its complete battle line on the western bank, their backs to the river they had just crossed, Mehran surveyed his formation with satisfaction. He had brought the full weight of the imperial military machine to this obscure secondary branch of the Furat. He intended to end the Arab frontier problem here, permanently, before the day was done. Mehran had the western bank as the Sassanid army formed its imposing, iron-heavy battle line. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha moved through his own forces with the methodical, unhurried precision of a veteran commander who has already fought the battle in his mind and knows exactly how it ends. He organized his 12,000 men into a layered, flexible formation that drew on both the lessons of the bridge disaster and his own decades of experience fighting on the Iraq frontier. He placed Jarir bin Abdullah al-Bejli over the right wing, a deliberate choice. Jarir commanded the Al-Azd tribal contingent, who were disciplined mountain fighters unused to the flat, open plains of El-Iraq, but who compensated with remarkable physical endurance and unit cohesion. The right wing's role would be to absorb pressure, to bend without breaking, to draw Sassanid attention and energy while Al-Muthanna prepared his killing stroke. The left wing was entrusted to the veteran commanders of the An-Nakha tribe, experienced desert fighters who understood fluid, mobile combat and could be trusted to maintain their positions under extreme pressure, without explicit orders. The center, the critical, decisive position, Al-Muthanna reserved for himself and his elite Benu Shiban cavalry. These were his personal instrument, the riders he had trained and fought alongside for years. They were fast, lethal, and capable of striking with devastating force from unexpected angles. Al-Muthanna rode down the battle line one final time before the advance. The historical accounts preserved by At-Taberi record fragments of what he said, not a polished oration designed for history, but the rough, direct speech of a battlefield commander addressing soldiers he knows personally. He reminded them of the bridge. He reminded them of the names of the dead. And then he delivered his tactical doctrine in a single, binding instruction. Hold. Do not move until I move. Absorb their shock. Wait for my signal. Across the narrowing strip of ground between the two armies, Mehran ben Badhan raised his arm. The Sassanid war drums, massive instruments carried on the backs of camels, capable of producing a sound that could be felt in the chest at 500 meters, erupted in a coordinated, deafening pulse. The war cry that answered those drums was not a human sound. It was the combined voice of the imperial host, a sound the Sassanid Empire had developed and refined over centuries of warfare, specifically to produce terror, and specifically to produce that crucial fraction of a second of hesitation that decides the outcome of a charge. The Sassanid archers leveled their bows and released the first volley before the infantry even began to move. A cloud of arrows so dense that witnesses, in the hyperbolically precise language of the medieval chronicles, described it as blocking the sun. The arrows fell on the Rashidun front lines with brutal accuracy, finding gaps in the tribal shields, punishing any soldier who failed to keep his cover tight. And then the Sassanid heavy infantry began to advance. They moved forward with a slow, grinding, mechanical momentum, the sound of thousands of iron-shod boots striking the earth in near-perfect synchronization, the crash of shield edges being kept tight and aligned, the loud commands of unit commanders keeping the line dressed and true. This was the authentic, industrial weight of the Sassanid war machine, not furious, not emotional, but systematic and relentless, like a millstone grinding wheat. The battle lines collided with sudden, devastating violence. The noise was indescribable, the simultaneous impact of thousands of spears on thousands of shields, the individual screams of men pierced and falling, the crash and grind of iron on iron, the war cries of the Arab tribes mixing with the disciplined commands of Sassanid officers. At Buwaib, in the summer of 634 CE, the river of vengeance officially began to overflow. For agonizing, grinding minutes that felt like hours to the men living through them, the Sassanid shield wall pressed relentlessly against the Rashidun front lines, threatening to rip open the Arab formation, to exploit the tribal seams between the Al-Azd contingent on the right and the En-Nakh veterans on the left, to fold the entire Muslim line back on itself and create the rout that would end the campaign. But the tribes held. With what the sources describe as hard endurance, the warriors of the Al-Azd, Kanana, and En-Nakh absorbed the crushing Sassanid momentum. Their locked shields became a wall, not the perfect mechanical wall of the imperial formation, but something more organic. A wall of individual human decisions, each man choosing in each moment not to be the one who takes one step backward and starts the collapse. The Rashidun archers answered the Sassanid arrow storm with their own. Lighter bows, fewer archers, less organized, but shooting with the accuracy developed by men who had hunted game in the desert since childhood. Every Sassanid officer who took an arrow to the throat or the eye socket was a gap in the command structure, a moment of hesitation rippling outward through the unit he commanded. In the center, Al-Muthanna sat on his horse, observed the grinding melee, with the cold, calculating focus of a man who has spent his entire life studying the moment when a battle breaks, the specific, fleeting instant when one side overextends, when the precision of an advancing formation begins to stretch and fragment, when gaps appear in the shield wall that no one can close because the momentum is already committed and cannot be reversed. He watched the Sassanid shield wall pressing forward. He watched his own front line bending under the pressure, bending but not breaking. He watched the Sassanid infantry beginning to leave the geometry of their original formation, pushing forward into the grinding melee, units beginning to separate from their neighbors as the battle terrain broke their alignment. He waited. The moment came when it always comes, when the superior force, confident in its weight and momentum, pushes just far enough that its flanks are no longer protected by the coherent formation that gave it power. Al-Muthanna drew his blade. He raised it above his head and turned to his elite Benu Shiban cavalry. He did not need to speak. They had trained for this moment for years. They understood the signal. They understood the physics of what was about to happen. The elite center cavalry exploded from their position with a velocity that was jarring, unexpected even to the Sassanid soldiers who had been watching the Arab center hold steady for the entire opening phase of the battle. They did not strike the front of the Sassanid shield wall. Al-Muthanna knew better. Instead, his riders carved through the chaos at a sharp angle, swerving wide of the melee and slamming directly into the extended, vulnerable left flank of the Sassanid formation with devastating force. The physical and psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. The Sassanid shield wall, designed and trained to resist frontal pressure, had no coherent response to a cavalry strike from the flank. The locked shields that were so powerful when facing forward were awkward and exposed when the threat came from 90 degrees to the side. Units that had been pushing forward with organized momentum suddenly found themselves being crushed from a direction they had not anticipated, their formation beginning to collapse inward. Sensing the shift in momentum, Jarir ben Abd Allah al-Begli led a ferocious counter-surge from the right wing. The El Azd warriors, who had been absorbing Sassanid pressure for the entire opening phase, now became the hammer, driving forward with a furious energy into the disrupted front of the imperial formation. The battle rapidly and completely transformed from a rigid, mechanical set-piece engagement into a chaotic, swirling, close-quarters meat grinder in which the Sassanid army's greatest advantage, unit cohesion, dissolved entirely. In the center of the swirling dust storm, a unit of elite Rashidun fighters, the historical sources identify them as warriors from the Ankar tribe, though accounts are not fully uniform on this point, identified and isolated the Sassanid command structure. They cut a bloody path directly toward the royal Sassanid standard, where Mehran was positioned with his cataphract escort, furiously issuing commands that were becoming increasingly irrelevant as his formation collapsed around him. The cataphract escort was engaged and overwhelmed. The protective screen of heavy cavalry surrounding Mehran was stripped away in a savage, close-range exchange of steel. The commander himself, a veteran of campaigns against Rome, a man who had fought and survived some of the most brutal warfare of the 6th and 7th centuries, was struck down in the blood-soaked confusion. A warrior from the Ankar tribe delivered the killing blow. Mehran ben Badhan fell into the dust of the El-Iraq plain, his magnificent armor shattered, his royal standard toppling with him. The sight of the supreme commander falling triggered absolute, instantaneous, irreversible panic through the Sassanid army. The proud columns that had crossed the El Farat an hour earlier in complete contempt of their enemy turned their backs and stampeded in a blind, frantic rout toward the boat bridge and found it seized. But Al-Muthanna had already anticipated this. He had anticipated it the moment he issued the order for the Sassanids to cross to him rather than crossing to them. Before the battle had even begun, he had deployed a highly mobile detachment of his Benu Shiban cavalry, his fastest, most trusted riders, in a wide flanking arc that brought them to the eastern edge of the boat bridge crossing. While the main battle consumed the attention of every Sassanid officer, this detachment had moved into position. The escape route was closed, completely and absolutely closed. The Sassanid heavy infantry and armoured cataphracts were trapped, compressed between the pursuing Rashidun forces behind them and the river that their own engineers had bridged for them in front. The geometry was exact, almost mathematical in its cruelty. They had crossed the El Farat to destroy their enemy. The El Farat now destroyed them. The armoured cataphracts drowned. Their armour, which made them nearly invincible in open battle, became their coffins in the rushing currents. Hundreds went to the bottom, pulled down by the weight of their own iron. Thousands of heavy infantrymen, unable to manoeuvre, unable to form the organised resistance their training demanded, were cut down where they stood on the bank. The historical sources, At-Tabari, Al-Baladhari and others, are unanimous in describing the scale of the Sassanid losses at Al-Buwaib as catastrophic. An elite imperial force was not merely defeated, not merely forced to retreat, it was destroyed as a coherent military entity. When the sun finally set over the plain of Al-Buwaib, a heavy, exhausted silence settled across the frontier. The Rashidun fighters moved through the aftermath with the mechanical, stunned movements of men who have survived something they were not certain they would survive. They tended their wounded. They counted their dead. They looked at the river. The El Farat secondary branch was running red. The armoured bodies of Sassanid soldiers floated in the currents or lay half-submerged at the banks. The boat bridge that had brought the imperial army across was tangled with the wreckage of the retreat. The western bank, which had been, 3 months earlier, the site of the Muslim army's greatest defeat, was now the site of the Sassanid Empire's most complete and costly battlefield disaster since the beginning of the Arab campaigns. The scale of what had happened at Al-Buwaib in the autumn of 634 CE was not immediately obvious to those who had just lived through it. But Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha, standing on the blood-washed bank in his battered armour, his face coated in the dust of the El-Iraq plain, Al-Muthanna understood. Battle of Al-Buwaib did not merely avenge the Battle of the Bridge. It shattered something deeper in the Sassanid strategic calculus, something that cannot be measured in casualty lists or territorial boundaries, but that is ultimately the most important factor in the outcome of long wars between great powers. It shattered the Sassanid certainty that the Arab armies could be permanently broken. In Ctesiphon, the news of Mehran's destruction landed with the force of a political earthquake. Rostam Farrokhzad, who had committed the elite of his eastern force to this punitive expedition, now faced a frontier situation fundamentally more dangerous than before the Battle of the Bridge. The cautious, methodical, resource-intensive approach that Rostam preferred was being systematically invalidated by the tactical genius of a desert commander who operated in the gaps of imperial strategy. More critically, Al-Buwaib reopened the strategic window on the El-Iraq frontier that had been slammed shut by the disaster at the bridge. The Caliphate, which had been reeling from the shock of the defeat and the logistical strain of rebuilding its frontier force, now found itself with a secure western bank, a devastated Sassanid field army, and a frontier that the empire would need weeks to reinforce. The road into El-Iraq was, for the moment, wide open. History remembers Khalid ben al-Walid as Saif Allah al-Maslul, yet it does not remember Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha with the same glory. And yet, at Al-Buwaib, it was Al-Muthanna who bore the weight of the frontier when collapse seemed inevitable. He was the commander who endured the disaster at Bridge, yet preserved enough cohesion to deny the Sassanids full exploitation. He was the man whose honest dispatch to Umar ben al-Khattab galvanized the Caliphate's mobilization, and he was the architect of the tactical reversal at Al-Buwaib, the battle that shattered a Sassanid's field army, secured the western bank, and reopened the road into El-Iraq, turning disaster into triumph in a single afternoon. He would not live to fight at al-Qadisiyyah. The wounds he had suffered, the deep cut taken at the Battle of the Bridge that never fully healed, the cumulative physical toll of years of unbroken frontier warfare would claim him before the final battle was joined. But the strategic foundation on which al-Qadisiyyah was built was laid at Al-Buwaib. The road to Al-Madain ran through the blood on that western bank. Stand on the banks of the El-Farat today, in the vast, sun-scorched plains of modern El-Iraq, where the river moves as it has always moved, brown and ancient and indifferent to the empires that have risen and fallen on its banks, and you stand at the intersection of civilizations. The Sumerians built their cities here. The Babylonians codified their law here. The Achaemenids extended their empire across this valley. The Parthians and the Sassanids made it the heartland of their power. And in the year 634 of the Common Era, on an unremarkable secondary branch of this river, the armies of a new civilization demonstrated that the old world was ending. Al-Buwaib was not the end of the Sassanid Empire. Al-Madain still stood. Yezdajerd Thalith still ruled. Rostam Farrokhzad was already planning his response, a massive, comprehensive mobilization of every available Sassanid resource for one final, definitive confrontation. A battle that would last 4 days. A battle that would decide the fate of empires. But Al-Buwaib was the moment when the Sassanid Empire lost its certainty. And in war, as in most human endeavors, the loss of certainty is often the beginning of the end. The stunning, complete victory at Al-Buwaib proved to the world, and more critically to the Caliphate itself, that the spirit of the early Muslim armies could not be broken by iron, or by elephants, or by the accumulated weight of 6 centuries of Sassanid imperial power. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha had taken the wreckage of a defeated army, rebuilt it in weeks, and transformed it into the instrument of the most decisive Arab victory of the Iraq campaign to date. He had turned catastrophe into strategy. He had turned grief into discipline. He had turned a river that the Sassanids had used to drown his predecessor into the grave of an imperial army. But Ctesiphon was not finished. The empire that had endured for 4 centuries, that had fought Rome to a standstill, that had twice sacked the greatest cities of the ancient world. That empire was not going to be decided by the loss of one general at a secondary crossing of the El-Farat. Rostam Farrokhzad was about to prove what he was made of, and the Caliphate was about to discover that Al-Buwaib, for all its glory, had only been the opening movement of the definitive struggle. In our next episode, we follow the massive logistical and political mobilization on both sides that will set the stage for the confrontation that will define the century. The road leads directly to the legendary 4-day battle, the clash that will end an empire and reshape the world. The road leads to al-Qadisiyyah. The victory at Al-Buwaib was a masterpiece of asymmetrical tactical recovery. On the blood-washed banks of the secondary loop of the Euphrates, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha Shaybani had shattered the elite imperial vanguard of Mehran ibn Badhan with devastating surgical precision. The myth of Sassanid invincibility, forged in the iron terror of the war elephants at the bridge, burned into the collective memory of every desert tribe along the Euphrates, had been systematically dismantled in the Iraqi dirt. For a fleeting, tentative moment, a heavy silence settled over the frontier. The annihilation of an entire imperial strike force did not force the great king at Ctesiphon to sue for peace. It drove the Sassanid high command into a state of total, existential mobilization. Across the river networks, deep within the triple-walled fortress of Ctesiphon, the young emperor Yazdegerd III, still in his early 20s, untested, presiding over a dynasty on the edge of fracture, and his supreme military commander, Rostam Farrokhzad, recognized what the border skirmishes had finally exposed. This was no longer a war to contain desert raiders. This was a war for the survival of the Iranian plateau itself. In al-Madinah, Caliph Umar ibn Khattab read the tactical dispatches from the front with cold, ruthless clarity. He understood the structural reality of the enemy. The Sassanid Empire was not a border kingdom or a regional power. It was the heir of Cyrus, Darius, and Khosrow, an apex predator with centuries of imperial muscle memory, a professional military machine that had been absorbing civilizations for over a millennium. To break a superpower permanently, you cannot merely defend a river loop. You must tear out its imperial heart. This is the road to al-Qadisiyyah. This is the story of how an entire civilization organized itself for the defining confrontation of its age. In the year 635 CE, Caliph Umar ibn Khattab issued a decree that permanently altered the demographic and military architecture of the ancient Near East. He did not merely call for a fresh vanguard or regional tribal levies. From the steps of the Prophet's mosque in al-Madinah, the Caliph declared a total, unmitigated pan-Arabia mobilization. His messengers rode out of the capital in every direction, carrying binding letters of conscription across thousands of miles of wilderness. The traditional tribal restrictions that had historically fragmented the peninsula were ruthlessly swept aside. The decree was absolute. Every tribe, every clan, every veteran companion, every poet, and every able-bodied man who possessed a horse, a camel, or an iron blade was ordered to march toward the mobilization grounds. This was a mobilization of unprecedented, terrifying scale. Umar was emptying the peninsula. He called upon the elite companions who had stood beside the Prophet at Badr and Uhud, men whose tactical literacy was matched only by their unbreakable ideological resolve. But most critically, he expanded the call to the remnants of the El-Reda tribes, the former rebels who had been excluded from imperial service since the wars of pacification under Abu Bakr. This was their ultimate chance at historical redemption, and they answered with the desperate, ferocious energy of men fighting to erase a generational stain. Umar's war council was in constant, heated session. The scale of the Sassanid threat was clear. To meet it in open battle, Umar would need to field an army that had no precedent in the history of the Arabian Peninsula. He would need, as he declared to his inner circle, kings to fight kings. The supreme command of this massive, multi-tribal host was a question of intense political and military hazard. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha al-Shaybani was a brilliant guerrilla specialist, but the grueling years of frontier warfare had broken his body. The old commander was dying of wounds sustained at the Battle of the Bridge, that disastrous river crossing where the impetuous Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi had driven his cavalry onto a bridge into Persian elephant lines and paid for his boldness with the lives of thousands. Al-Muthanna had preserved what could be preserved from that catastrophe, and it had cost him everything. Umar needed a commander whose loyalty to the state was absolute, whose prestige was unquestioned by the elite of the Hijaz, and whose lineage commanded immediate, universal obedience from the volatile tribal chieftains. Senior companions debated the question for days. Some urged the Caliph himself to lead the army into Iraq. They argued that no commander could inspire the men the way Umar could in person. The council refused. The administrative core of the state could not be risked on the front lines. Then a name emerged from the inner circle: Saad ibn Abi Waqqas. Saad ibn Abi Waqqas was a foundational pillar of the early Islamic community. He was among the very first to accept the faith. In those dangerous early days in Mecca, before the community had a name, before there was a mosque, before the first battle had been fought. He was a veteran of every critical early engagement. He was from Benu Zahra, the clan of the Prophet's mother, making him, in the intimate language of Arabian kinship, the maternal uncle of the Messenger of God, and he was historically recognized across the sources as the first man ever to fire an arrow in defense of the faith, a distinction that granted him an almost mythological status among the fighters. He was not a reckless, forward momentum commander in the mold of Abu Ubaid, whose impetuous advance at the bridge had ended in catastrophe. Nor was he a purely regional desert raider. Saad was a disciplined, methodical commander, a man who understood that war was logistics, patience, and organization as much as it was courage. Umar handed Saad the supreme command banner of the Eastern Front and delivered a legendary, binding instruction preserved faithfully across the classical sources. "O Saad, let it not deceive you that it is said you are the uncle of the Messenger of God and his companion. For God does not erase evil with evil, he erases evil with good. March with the fear of God in your heart. Know that piety is the greatest of all military provisions, and the soldier who carries God consciousness into battle carries a weapon no enemy can match." With those words, Saad turned his horse north. At the staging grounds of Syria, on the outskirts of Medina, the scale of the Pan-Arabia mobilization became a physical reality. Week after week, the horizon buckled under the weight of incoming tribal contingents. The mountain clans of Yemen arrived in disciplined columns, bringing thousands of battle-hardened archers, men who had been drawing bows since childhood in the thin mountain air. The fierce horsemen of Kanana and Tamim rode into the camp, their mounts kicking up an unbroken, choking cloud of desert dust that hung over the valley for miles. The tribes of Najd and the Hijaz sent their finest. Men who had fought on opposing sides in the Ereda wars now pitched their tents side by side, bound by a single, overwhelming collective purpose. Poets moved through the encampment, composing verses of martial glory, some of which would survive in the literary canon for 1,000 years. Blacksmiths worked through the nights, reshaping blades and repairing chaincoats by firelight. The camp was not merely an army assembling, it was a civilization in motion. As the supreme force finalized its organization, grim news arrived from the frontier. Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha Shaybani had succumbed to his wounds on the banks of the Euphrates. The legendary desert wolf of Beni Shiban was gone. The accounts preserved in the classical sources tell us he left final tactical counsel for his successor, transmitted through his commanders, if not delivered directly. Do not cross the river into the Sassanid heartland prematurely. Force the Persians to come to you, onto the edge of the desert, where their armored formations become rigid and your mobile columns remain free. The mantle of the Iraqi frontier had now fully passed to Saad. Saad ibn Abi Waqqas spent months at the staging grounds, systematically cataloguing every contingent, resolving ancient tribal blood feuds that threatened unit cohesion, and restructuring the host into a modern, synchronized military formation. He broke the army into standard tactical divisions, appointing trusted veterans over the vanguard, the flanks, and the supply lines. He was not building a tribal warband. He was building an imperial military force, one capable of sustained operational warfare against the most organized army on earth. Saad did not rush blindly toward the frontier. He executed a highly disciplined, multi-stage advance through the northern Arabian shelf, establishing forward supply bases at every phase, ensuring that his logistical lifeline back to the Hijaz remained intact throughout. His first major operational halt was at Sharaf, deep in the transitional zone between the desert and the Mesopotamian basin. At Sharaf, Saad spent weeks meticulously absorbing the frontier veterans who had served under Al-Muthanna. The fusion of the fresh, highly motivated pan-Arab levies from the Hijaz with the battle-hardened frontier survivalists created a balanced, lethal military organism. one that combined the ideological fire of the new arrivals with the hard, practical, tactical knowledge of men who had been operating in the Iraqi theatre for years. Saad reorganized his entire host into precise tactical units, binding every tribal contingent to a strict, synchronized chain of command. From Sharaf, Saad aggressively deployed reconnaissance outriders across the Euphrates border networks. Sassanid border security forces, deeply unsettled by the sheer scale of the arriving Arab columns, began systematically abandoning their forward watchtowers. The intelligence flowing back to Saad was consistent. The Persian main force had not yet moved from its logistical base near the capital. The window was open. Saad ordered the main host forward, marching onto the vast plain of al-Qadisiyyah, a critical geographical node sitting precisely on the boundary between the barren Arabian desert and the fertile, irrigated interior of the Persian Empire. At Al-Adhib, the last major way station before the plain itself, the Muslim army made its final organizational adjustments. Water sources were mapped, supply lines were secured. The army fanned out into its battle formation on the vast, open expanse, establishing a camp that would become one of the most consequential military positions in the history of the ancient world. The desert sanctuary was at Saad's back. He was honoring Al-Muthanna's dying counsel to the letter. As the Muslim host settled into their positions, Rostam Farrokhzad received the news of their arrival with deep strategic anxiety. He was not yet ready to commit his full force to the field. His logistical and organizational preparations were still ongoing. He needed time. He sent a message to the Muslim camp requesting that Saad send a high-ranking envoy to meet with him directly, ostensibly to negotiate, functionally to delay. Saad selected a man of unconventional genius. Rabi' ben Amir ad-Tamimi was not an aristocrat or a decorated general. He was a warrior of the common rank, and that, Saad understood, was precisely the point. The envoy who walked into the most powerful military commander in the known world's tent should not look like he was trying to impress. He should look like a man who simply had no need to. The accounts preserved by al-Tabari and al-Baladuri describe what followed in remarkable, almost theatrical detail. Rabi rode into Rustam's magnificent military pavilion on a small, deliberately unremarkable horse. He dismounted, drove the blunt end of his spear into the earth of the pavilion floor as a walking staff, stepped directly across the priceless Persian rugs without removing his sandals, and sat down on the cushions, still wearing his worn iron helmet and rough, undyed wool cloak. The assembled Persian nobles and staff officers stared in open, aristocratic disbelief at the audacity of the gesture. Rustam, surrounded by his commanders in full ceremonial dress, spoke first. "What has brought you here? What is it that you want?" Rabi' ben Amir did not hesitate. He delivered what would become one of the most celebrated declarations in the entire Arabic historical literary tradition. God has sent us to deliver whoever wishes from the worship of people to the worship of God alone, from the narrowness of this world to its expanse, and from the injustice of religions to the justice of Islam. Whoever accepts our message, we respect him and his land. Whoever refuses, we fight him until we reach the promise of God. Rustam pressed him. "And what is the promise of God?" Rabi replied without a tremor, "Paradise for our martyrs and victory for our survivors." Rustam dismissed him and requested more time to deliberate. The diplomatic delay was exactly what he needed, but something in the exchange had unsettled him in a way he struggled to articulate to his commanders. The men across the plain were not behaving like raiders who wanted loot or tribute. They were behaving like men who genuinely believed they were on the right side of history. And in Rustam's long career of professional warfare, he had never encountered that combination before. Determined to gather further intelligence and exhaust Muslim patience, Rustam requested additional envoys. Saad obliged. Hadhifa ben Mahsan al-Gulfani entered Rustam's camp and delivered the same message with the same unshakable calm. Then Al-Mughira ben Shaba, one of the most politically agile minds in the Muslim leadership, entered the Persian pavilion and engaged Rostam in a deeper, more personal exchange. Al-Mughira walked through the camp with deliberate, unimpressed eyes, studying the Persian formations, the logistical columns, the organizational depth of the force arrayed against the Arab army. Then he sat before Rostam and spoke directly. "I have seen your armies and your preparations. Not one of these things frightens us. We have faced armies like yours before, and God gave us victory. I ask you again, choose from among the three options our messengers have already offered." Rostam, privately exhausted by the exchanges and deeply troubled by the intelligence they revealed about the psychological cohesion of the Muslim camp, confided to a trusted advisor after the final embassy, "These men are not motivated by the hunger for silver or land. I have never encountered an army like this in my life. They are bound together by something we do not have, and I do not know what it is." He paused for a long time. Then he ordered his commanders to begin the final march from An-Najaf toward al-Qadisiyyah. One final diplomatic exchange made the crossing, and it was the one that shattered the facade permanently. The accounts recorded in Al-Tabari describe how Yazdegerd III, young, politically exposed, and surrounded by a court seething with wounded imperial pride, received an Arab delegation and responded with contempt designed to humiliate. He ordered his court servants to bring out a heavy basket of common Persian earth from the palace grounds and force it onto the shoulders of the lead envoy, Asim ben Amru, declaring contemptuously that this soil was the only portion of Persia the Arabs would ever possess. Asim ben Amru gripped the basket without flinching, walked out of the imperial presence without a word, mounted his horse, and rode directly back to the Muslim lines at al-Qadisiyyah. He charged straight into the command tent of Saad ibn Abi Waqqas, set the heavy basket of earth down on the tactical table, and announced in a voice that carried through the entire camp, "Rejoice, O Saad! By God, the great king has just personally handed us the keys to his empire. Today, he has surrendered the very soil of Persia into our hands." The Muslim camp erupted. The roar of tens of thousands of men carried across the plain and rattled the nerves of the outriders on the Persian perimeter. The diplomatic facade was permanently shattered. Both sides knew what was coming. The question was only when. The symbolic surrender of Persian soil sent a shockwave of profound strategic dread through the Sassanid high command. Rostam Farrokhzad was deeply aware of the ancient Zoroastrian and Persian astrological traditions that governed how his officers interpreted omens. The emperor's careless gesture with the earth had, in the eyes of many within the ranks, fulfilled a dark prophecy. His soldiers were talking. The time for calculated delays was dead. With a heavy heart, Rostam ordered the gate locks of the logistical fortress at An-Najaf thrown open. The massive, mechanized core of the Sassanid imperial military began to pour out onto the Mesopotamian floodplain like an iron river. The classical sources, including Al-Tabari, drawing on Saad ibn Umar, describe a Persian host of enormous scale. Estimates range from 60,000 to over 100,000 across different traditions, with modern historians suggesting approximately 60 to 80,000 professional troops and auxiliaries as the most defensible range. The precise figure is contested. The structural reality is not. This was the full combat power of a superpower in existential crisis. At the absolute center of this colossal host rode Rostam himself, his ornate silver armor reflecting the harsh Mesopotamian sun, surrounded by his elite personal cavalry guard. Flanking his command position were 33 towering war elephants, colossal, living fortresses draped in thick chainmail barding, their tusks tipped with sharpened iron blades, their backs carrying wooden towers packed with expert archers and javelin throwers. and floating high above the entire vanguard was the Derefsha Kawyani, the legendary royal war standard of the Sassanid Empire, encrusted with gold and precious gems, its presence on the field signaling to every soldier across the entire formation that the empire was committing its absolute existence to the outcome of this battle. Rustam marched his massive host down toward the Euphrates networks, but true to his deep defensive instincts, he did not rush into an immediate engagement. He halted his main forces at a fortified position on the near bank of the Atik Channel, establishing an intricate logistical base directly across from the Muslim lines. For weeks, stretching into months, the two massive civilizations sat face to face across the narrow frontier, watching each other like two apex predators locked in the agonizing calculation of a fatal strike. Though the main armies remained stationary, the standoff was far from peaceful. Saad ibn Abi Waqqas aggressively exploited the structural flexibility of his mobile desert forces. He unleashed swift, highly coordinated cavalry raiding parties to systematically disrupt the Persian supply columns and terrorize their foraging operations. Elite Muslim raiders, executing operations under the cover of darkness, repeatedly infiltrated the outer perimeters of the Sassanid camp, driving off thousands of sheep and camels to feed the growing army at al-Qadisiyyah, and crucially, demonstrating to the Persian conscripts that their camp perimeter was not secure. These constant, bruising skirmishes served a vital dual purpose. For Saad, they kept his volatile tribal contingents focused and active, preventing the internal political friction that had historically torn apart Arab coalition armies during periods of extended inaction. For the Sassanid forces, the endless, unpredictable raids chipped away at professional discipline, sowing a deep, toxic seed of frustration and unease among both the conscripts and the noble cavalrymen. Rustam received the daily raid reports with grinding, silent fury. His perfectly organized army was being psychologically dismantled before the first formal line of battle had been drawn. The classical sources give us a remarkable window into Rustam's state of mind during the weeks before the battle. Al-Tabari preserves accounts of his nightly consultations with his senior commanders, debates that reveal an extraordinary degree of strategic doubt within the heart of the Sassanid high command. Rustam reportedly told his advisors that the Arab army across the plain had something he had never seen in an enemy force before: an absence of apparent fractures. No tribal politics seemed to be undermining the command structure. No supply crisis was driving the Muslims toward premature attack. The force across the plain was simply waiting, patiently, indefinitely. The astrologers attached to the royal court had been returning consistently troubling verdicts for weeks. Rustam dismissed them publicly. Privately, accounts suggest he was deeply shaken. He wrote to Yazdegerd III, requesting permission to delay the engagement further, offering a detailed strategic rationale for a prolonged defensive posture. The emperor, young, politically exposed, and surrounded by a court seething with martial pride, refused categorically. The order came back absolute: advance, engage, and destroy. Rustam gathered his senior commanders for the final pre-battle briefing. "I know what I know," he told them, "but the king has commanded. We march at dawn, fight hard, fight well. If God wills it, we will be victorious." It was, by any account, the speech of a man who did not fully believe in his own victory. As the weeks of standoff ground on, the mathematical calculus of the confrontation experienced a massive, decisive shift. High-speed scouts rode into Saad's command camp, carrying urgent dispatches from the Western theatre of war. The great campaigns in Syria and the Levant had reached a monumental milestone. The crushing Muslim victory at Yarmouk, where the armies of Heraclius had been shattered on the banks of the Yarmouk River, had temporarily stabilized the entire Western Front, releasing an elite nucleus of battle-hardened veterans to reinforce the Iraqi theatre. A formidable contingent of approximately 6,000 seasoned warriors emerged from the western desert horizon. Their clothes were bleached by the Syrian sun and their armor scarred from the desperate fighting against the Byzantine legions. At their head rode El-Ghaqar ben Amru at-Tamimi, a warrior of legendary personal combat prowess and brilliant tactical intuition, whose name would echo through the literary tradition of the Arabs for generations. These were men who had faced down the disciplined heavy infantry of Rome and won. Their arrival injected a cold, calculating professional confidence into every tent in the pan-Arab army. Al-Ghaqar understood the psychological moment with precision. Accounts in Al-Tabari describe how, upon arrival, he did not rest his men or wait for a formal military review. He rode immediately to Saad's command tent and offered a tactical proposal of remarkable simplicity and psychological genius. He would advance his veterans toward the Persian lines in rotating waves, each successive wave launching before the previous one had returned, creating the impression of an endless stream of fresh reinforcements arriving from the west. The effect on the morale of the Sassanid conscripts watching from across the plain would be corrosive and irreversible. Saad approved the plan immediately. With the arrival of the Syrian reinforcements, the total Muslim strength at al-Qadisiyyah swelled to approximately 30,000 fighting men. Saad ibn Abi Waqqas stood before his unified lines on the eve of battle and surveyed what Umar's decree had built from the dust of the peninsula. The elite companions of the earliest days of the faith stood beside the redemption-seeking veterans of the Red Wars. The hardened frontier survivalists of Beni Shiban stood beside the iron soldiers fresh from the killing ground of Yarmouk. On the final night before the armies met, the classical sources tell us that Saad led the entire assembled army in the night prayer on the plain of al-Qadisiyyah. 30,000 men, Hijazis and Yemenis, former rebels and veteran companions, men of honor and men seeking redemption, bent together in the darkness of the Iraqi plain. The sound of the communal supplication rose in the pre-dawn air and carried, the sources say, to the ears of the Sassanid sentries across the channel. Some of those sentries, Al-Tabari tells us, wept without knowing why. Rostam spent the same night in his command pavilion, unable to sleep. The accounts describe him pacing under the vast, jeweled war standard. He had done everything a consummate professional soldier could do. He had delayed, probed, negotiated, argued for caution, and assembled the full mechanical weight of the greatest land army in the ancient world. He had 33 war elephants. He had the Darafsh Kawiyani flying over his head, and yet he could not sleep. The long, agonizing months of mobilization, diplomacy, and psychological warfare were finally at an end. Saad ibn Abi Waqqas had masterfully assembled the full, unified military spirit of the Arabian Peninsula, a weapon forged from faith, tribal pride, historical guilt, and the cold ambition of men who believed they were building a new world. And Rostam Farrokhzad had brought forth the absolute, mechanical pinnacle of Sassanid imperial power. Tens of thousands of professional soldiers, the Darafsh Kawiyani, and 33 living fortresses armored in chainmail and iron. Two entire civilizations had fully concentrated their wealth, their steel, and their ideological soul onto a single sun-baked plain. The road to al-Qadisiyyah had reached its destination. In our next episode, the storm finally breaks. We dive directly into the epic, multi-day catastrophe and triumph of the most consequential engagement in the history of the Arab conquests, the Battle of Al-Qadisiyyah. There is a question that historians have asked for 1400 years. How? How did a collection of desert tribes, men who had never governed a city, never administered an empire, never built a siege engine or maintained a professional standing army, how did they march out of the bone-dry wastes of the Arabian Peninsula and within a single decade destroy not one but two of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever produced? The Roman Empire, the Sassanid Persian Empire. Gone. Not weakened, not pushed back. Gone. The answer, the real answer, stripped of mythology and stripped of later political embellishment, lies here. On a flat, sun-baked, blood-soaked plain beside the Atik Canal, south of the ancient Euphrates channels, in what is today southern Iraq. Al-Qadisiyyah, in the year 15 of the Hijra, corresponding to the year 636 of the Common Era, over the course of 4 days and 3 nights, the Muslim armies of the Rashidun Caliphate and the imperial war machine of Sassanid Persia met on a plain that would become one of the most consequential battlefields in human history. What happened on that plain was not a miraculous, divine accident. It was the product of extraordinary generalship, unprecedented tribal discipline, terrifying individual courage, and 4 days of grinding, apocalyptic violence that pushed the boundaries of human endurance to the absolute limit. To understand what happened at Al-Qadisiyyah, you must first understand what the world looked like in the year 636. Because this was not simply a military confrontation between two armies. This was a civilizational collision between two entirely different models of human organization. On one side, the Sassanid Persian Empire, one of the oldest continuous imperial traditions on earth, tracing its lineage through the Achaemenids to Cyrus the Great. Their capital, Ctesiphon, the magnificent twin city of Ctesiphon and Seleucia on the Tigris, was one of the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated urban centers in the ancient world. The Sassanid state maintained a professional standing army built around heavily armored cavalry, the Savaran cataphracts, and the supreme psychological weapon of the ancient world, war elephants imported from India. Their military doctrine had been refined over centuries. Their logistics infrastructure was immense. They had spent 20 years in an existential, grinding war with the Romans, a war that had bled them almost to collapse. But the institutional memory of Persian military greatness remained fully intact. On the other side, the Rashidun Caliphate, an entity that, 15 years prior, had not existed. A political and religious movement born in the city of El-Medina, animated by the new faith of Islam, governed by the formidable Caliph Umar bin al-Khattab, a man of towering administrative genius and iron personal discipline. The Arab armies that had swept through the Syrian and Iraqi frontiers were not professional soldiers in any conventional sense. They were tribal warriors, extraordinarily mobile, ferociously motivated, supremely skilled in desert and close-quarters combat, and bound together by a new ideological solidarity that had replaced centuries of intertribal warfare with a unified, outward-facing energy that the ancient world had never encountered before. The road to Al-Qadisiyyah had been paved with blood. The Arab push into Iraq, the ancient Mesopotamian heartland, had not been a clean, linear conquest. It had been a brutal, back-and-forth struggle punctuated by disaster as much as triumph. The Arab commander, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha Shaybani, had been the architect of the early Iraqi campaign, a brilliant, aggressive raider who had repeatedly struck deep into Persian territory. But at Maraka al-Jessr, the Battle of the Bridge, fought in the year 13 of the Hijra, the Arabs had suffered a catastrophic defeat. Drawn into a set-piece engagement on ground entirely chosen by the Persians, with the Euphrates at their backs and war elephants in their faces, the Arab army was shattered. Thousands drowned in the river. The commander, Abu Ubaid bin Mas'ud al-Thaqafi, was trampled to death beneath a war elephant after personally attacking the beast with his sword. in an act of courage that cost him his life. Al-Muthanna himself was mortally wounded, carrying a wound that would eventually claim him months later, but not before he had held the remnant of the army together and withdrawn it from total annihilation. The Battle of the Bridge was the worst military catastrophe in the short history of the Caliphate. It proved one critical lesson. The Arab tribal model of swift, decentralized raiding warfare could not simply walk into a Sassanid set-piece engagement and expect to survive. The Caliphate needed a different kind of commander for the next round. Umar bin al-Khattab spent months, agonizing, deliberate months, selecting that commander. He was offered the greatest warriors of the age. He was offered men of tribal prestige and personal combat glory. He rejected them all. He considered leading the army himself and was dissuaded by his senior companions. He considered Khalid bin al-Walid, whose brilliance on the Syrian front was without equal, but Khalid had recently been relieved of command and the political difficulties were insuperable. The man Umar eventually selected was Saad ibn Abi Waqqas. Saad was not the most feared duelist in Arabia. He was not the most charismatic tribal orator. What Saad possessed was something far rarer and far more valuable against an imperial war machine. He was a master of organizational command. He understood logistics. He understood combined arms coordination across disparate tribal contingents. He understood the necessity of intelligence, of fortification, and of supply line security. He was, in the full sense of the word, a general, not merely a champion. He was also one of the earliest converts to Islam, among the first 10 by many accounts, a man of unimpeachable personal credibility and direct connection to the founding generation of the faith. His authority was therefore both military and moral. The classical sources record that the Prophet himself had said of Saad, "He was the first man to draw blood on behalf of Islam and the first to shoot an arrow in its defense." Um's instructions to Saad were precise and uncompromising. He was to march to al-Ubaid and consolidate his forces at al-Qadisiyyah, and there he was to stand, fortify, and force the Sassanid Empire into a decisive engagement on ground of his choosing. Not a raid, not a skirmish, the battle. The battle that would determine whether the Arabs would hold Iraq or be pushed back into the desert forever. What followed was one of the most extraordinary strategic standoffs in ancient military history. For months, the classical sources disagree on the precise duration, with some suggesting as many as 4 to 6 months. The two armies remained in position, watching each other across the flat plain of al-Qadisiyyah. Saad constructed a fortified camp and established his command post in Qasr al-Ubaid, an ancient palace structure that dominated the surrounding terrain. From its elevated rooftop, Saad conducted his tactical oversight over the entire battlefield. During this period, both sides engaged in an intense campaign of psychological warfare, military probing, and diplomatic theatre. The Sassanid supreme commander, Rostam Farrokhzad, was a man of genuine military distinction. He had been the effective regent of the empire during the chaos of the recent succession crisis, a kingmaker who had placed the young Yazdijerd Thalith on the Sassanid throne. He now bore the full, crushing responsibility of defending Persian civilization from this unexpected desert invasion. The classical sources present Rostam as a reluctant commander at al-Qadisiyyah. He understood, with the clear eyes of a professional, that his army had significant structural advantages: numbers, equipment, war elephants, the logistical support of an intact imperial infrastructure. But he also understood the dangers of underestimating an enemy that had already proven capable of defeating Persian field armies in open battle. Several of his subordinate commanders reportedly pressed him forward into engagement. Rustam's own instinct was caution. Before the battle, Rustam sent a series of diplomatic envoys to the Muslim camp and received Muslim envoys in his own pavilion. The classical chronicles, primarily at Tabari and Ibn al-Athir, record these exchanges in extraordinary detail. The Muslim diplomats arrived not as suppliants, but as the emissaries of a civilization that genuinely believed it was offering Rustam a choice. The envoys sent by Saad included Rabi ben Amir al-Asti and al-Mughira ben Shu'bah, and a Nu'man ben Muqarrin al-Muzni. Each arrived in Rustam's magnificent pavilion, surrounded by gilded furniture, silk carpets, and the full theatrical splendor of Persian imperial court ceremony, and each refused to be impressed by it. Rabi ben Amir entered on his horse, driving the animal's hooves into the silken carpets, and presented himself without ceremony before the commander of the most powerful empire in the world. The choice Saad's envoys offered was identical each time. Enter Islam, and you are our brothers, with your land and your governance intact. Pay the jizya and retain your faith and your autonomy under our protection, or face battle on the plain. Rustam, by the account of At-Tabari, heard these offers with increasing frustration. The idea that a commander of his stature should negotiate on anything approaching equal terms with desert tribesmen was, from the Persian perspective, almost cosmically absurd. He rejected the terms. The final diplomatic meeting ended. The talking was over. The classical sources record one haunting final symbolic exchange that the Arab tradition preserved with evident relish. Asim ben Amru at-Tamimi, upon departing Yazid-Agad III's court, was reportedly given a basket of Persian earth, a ritual diplomatic gesture, the meaning of which was, "Take this and depart, for this earth does not belong to you." Asim reportedly accepted the basket calmly, tied it to his saddle, and rode back to the Muslim camp. When he arrived, it was taken as a sign. The earth of El-Iraq had been given to them by the Persians themselves. As the month of Al-Muharram in the year 15 of the Hijra deepened into winter, the critical strategic variable that Rustam had been waiting for finally resolved against him. A substantial force of Arab auxiliaries and tribal allies that had been expected to reinforce his left flank failed to arrive. Simultaneously, Saad received intelligence that a column of Syrian veterans, battle-hardened men who had fought at Yarmouk just months earlier, was marching hard across the desert toward al-Qadisiyyah. Rustam understood that delay was now working against him. Every week, his army sat in position. The Arab force grew more conditioned to the terrain, more internally cohesive, and more likely to receive reinforcements that would close the numerical gap. The Persian commander, against his own professional instincts, was forced by strategic circumstance to act. He gave the order to cross. In the cold, grey hours before dawn, the Sassanid engineering corps began the methodical, terrifying process of throwing pontoon bridges across the Atik Canal, the primary water obstacle separating the two armies. The crossing consumed the better part of an entire day. It was a colossal logistical achievement and simultaneously a slow-motion psychological assault on the watching Arab army. Column after column of Sassanid heavy infantry crossed in strict geometric order, their iron-rimmed shields and long spears catching the pale winter light. Then the Savaran cavalry, the heavy cataphracts, horses and riders alike, draped in chainmail and lamella armor, moving in disciplined squadrons. And then the vanguard that every Arab veteran had been dreading since the nightmare of the bridge. The war elephants. The sources give varying numbers for the elephant corps at al-Qadisiyyah. At-Tabari records 15 elephants in some traditions and larger figures in others. The consensus of modern scholarship, working from the full classical tradition, At-Tabari, al-Baladhari, Ibn al-Athir, Ibn Sa'd, suggests somewhere between 15 and 33 elephants as the most historically defensible range. Each animal was a moving mountain of muscle, carrying a fortified wooden tower, the howdah, on its back, manned by elite archers and javelin throwers. Each beast was worth, in the calculus of ancient psychological warfare, an entire regiment of cavalry. When the sun burned through the morning haze on what would become the first day of battle, the full Sassanid formation was revealed across the flat expanse of al-Qadisiyyah. The numbers recorded in the classical sources vary enormously, and modern historians approach the largest estimates with appropriate skepticism. At-Tabari and al-Baladhari offer figures ranging from 60,000 to figures exceeding 100,000. Modern scholarship typically works with a range of 60 to 100,000 effective combatants. Still an enormous force by any standard of the era, and dwarfing the Muslim army facing it. The formation Rostam deployed was a masterpiece of Sassanid military doctrine. At the center, Rostam commanded in person from an elevated platform shaded by an imperial canopy. Above his head flew the Darafsh Kawyani, the great jewel-encrusted royal standard of the Persian Empire, woven with the skin of the legendary blacksmith carver and set with rubies, gold and sapphires of extraordinary size. The Darafsh Kawyani was not merely a flag. It was the physical embodiment of Persian imperial legitimacy, an object of such profound symbolic power that its fall would mean something beyond military defeat. Around Rustam's throne, the imperial bodyguard formed a steel ring. The right wing was commanded by the veteran general Jalinus, who had considerable experience on the Roman frontier. His formation was anchored by heavy cataphract cavalry and supported by Eastern provincial infantry. The left wing was commanded by Mehran ben Behram ar-Razi. Mehran forces, composed of Western Persian provincial levies and additional cavalry. Across both wings and at the center, the war elephants were distributed at the critical stress points of the formation, concentrated specifically where the Persian command judged the Arab cavalry would be most likely to press. The Muslim army facing this formation was considerably smaller. The classical sources most commonly cite figures around 30,000, though, as with all ancient battle figures, these must be treated as approximations. Saad had organized his force into the standard tribal contingent structure, with each major tribal group constituting a semi-autonomous unit under its own commander. The tribal distribution was carefully considered. The right wing was held primarily by warriors of Bajila under Qais ben Makshuh al-Muradi, supplemented by contingents from Kenda wa Rabi'a. The left wing included the tribal warriors of Asad wa Tamim. The center was held by the core Medinan and Meccan fighters alongside the Bekr ben Wail tribal confederation. Among the tribal commanders present at al-Qadisiyah, the classical sources preserve a remarkable roll call of the age's finest warriors. Amr ben Mahdi Kerb az-Zubaydi, one of the most celebrated individual fighters of the era, whose personal combat reputation stretched back decades before the Islamic conquests. Tulayha ben Khuwaylid al-Asdi, a man who had led a rebellion during the Ridda Wars and claimed prophethood, now fighting with the desperate intensity of a man seeking redemption before God. An-Nu'man ben Muqarrin al-Mazeni, the diplomat who had faced Rustam and who would command a section of the Arab line with distinction throughout the battle. Hashim ben Utbah ben Abi Waqqas, nephew of the supreme commander himself, whose role would become critical on the second day. Asim ben Amr at-Tamimi, whose individual action on the third day would reshape the battle. And al-Qaqa ben Amr at-Tamimi, perhaps the most important single warrior on the entire field, whose name alone would become a symbol of the Caliphate's military genius. But the single most extraordinary fact about the Arab command at al-Qadisiyah is this: Saad ibn Abi Waqqas could not walk. In the weeks leading up to the battle, Saad had been struck by a devastating bout of irq an-nasa, sciatica, so severe that he was completely unable to mount a horse, unable to stand, and frequently unable even to sit upright. The condition was compounded by agonizing, infected boils covering significant portions of his body. He lay for the entirety of the 4-day battle, prostrate on his chest, across the roof of Qasr al-Udhaib, his body on fire with pain, commanding his army through a system of written dispatches thrown down to his adjutants in the courtyard below. For a tribal army that traditionally expected its supreme commander to be the first man into the fight, the first to bleed, the first to demonstrate personal courage before demanding it of others, this physical incapacity was a potential catastrophe for morale. Saad addressed it directly. He summoned his senior commanders to the fortress and told them without diplomacy, his eye would command what his arm could not. Nothing that happened on that plain would escape his sight. Obey the orders that reached them, and they would prevail. It was an extraordinary act of organizational authority, and it worked. There is a darker dimension to the command situation that the classical sources also record. Saad's wife, Selma bint Khusf al-Anziya, was present at the battle, and when some Arab fighters, seeing their commander unable to fight, began to murmur criticism of his leadership, she confronted them directly and sharply. The classical sources preserve a famous exchange in which she rebuked those who questioned Saad, defending both his physical condition and his strategic genius in language that left little room for further complaint. Saad then delivered his tactical briefing. He ordered the army not to advance until he had personally signaled the attack from the fortress roof. His signal system was elegant and unmistakable. He would shout the takbir, Allah Akbar, 4 times, and each cry had a distinct meaning. On the first, ready weapons. On the second, check and secure all armor and equipment. On the third, encourage your brothers on either side of you. On the fourth, advance. The armies of the Caliphate and the Persian Empire faced each other across the empty plain of al-Qadisiyyah. The silence, as the classical chroniclers record it, was absolute. This was Yom Armath, the day of Armath, the name recorded in the Arabic chronicle tradition, the day of confusion. Before the formal armies could crash into each other, ancient battle protocol demanded its opening ritual. The Mubarza, the individual duel. Heavily armored Sassanid champions rode out from the Persian lines into the open ground between the two armies, their voices carrying the formal challenge across the plain. In response, the Caliphate's elite duelists broke from their lines. These men were the al-Mubarizun. Their entire martial identity was oriented toward this exact moment. They were not simply brave fighters, they were trained psychological operators whose function was to shatter enemy morale through spectacular, visible acts of individual supremacy before the armies ever made contact. The classical sources preserve a remarkable account of the individual combats that opened al-Qadisiyyah. Among the Sassanid champions who rode out that morning were men of the highest nobility, sons of great houses, officers of the imperial guard, whose deaths before their own army would be visible, humiliating, and psychologically devastating. The Arab duelists who met them included Amru bin Mahdi Kurb az-Zabidi, whose sword, the as-Samsama, was already legendary throughout Arabia. He moved through the Sassanid champions with the economical, terrifying violence of a man for whom this kind of combat was simply a technical exercise. Tulayha ben Khuwaylid al-Asadi, the former rebel prophet, fought with the reckless fury of a man who had something to prove to both his commanders and his god. Hashim ben Utbah fought in the center, absorbing the challenge of Persian champions with methodical precision. The classical sources, following the tradition of At-Tabari, record that prominent Sassanid officers, men of noble birth and military distinction, fighting in front of their own entire army, were killed one by one, unhorsed and left bleeding in the dust of the plain. The psychological wave that swept through the Persian front lines was palpable. Rostam, watching from his elevated throne, made a decision. He ordered the formal duels to end. He gave the signal. The Sassanid war drums erupted. Rustam's initial assault was concentrated and tactically deliberate. Rather than committing his entire line, he ordered a punching assault on his left wing, spearheaded by the war elephants assigned to that sector. The target was the Arab right wing, held by the warriors of Bajila, one of the Yemeni tribal contingents, brave and experienced fighters, but without prior exposure to the coordinated horror of a massed elephant charge. What happened in the next 10 minutes was a near catastrophe. The Arab war horses had been trained for combat. They had been ridden against men, against blades, against arrows, but no amount of training had prepared them for what now came. The elephants did not merely charge, they were a sensory apocalypse. The sight of them, walls of grey chain-mailed muscle, the wooden towers looming above, the archers silhouetted against the winter sky, was terrifying enough. But the smell was the decisive factor. The ancient sources are remarkably consistent on this point. The primal scent of the war elephant triggered something below conscious conditioning in the Arab war horses, something ancient, deep, and completely uncontrollable. The Bajila cavalry disintegrated, not from cowardice, from biology. Their horses reared, threw their riders, bit at each other in panic, and scattered in every direction. Veteran cavalrymen who had ridden through arrow storms and spear walls were powerless, thrown to the ground by animals beyond all command. With the Bajila horse gone, the infantry was exposed to the full weight of the elephant assault. The Sassanid war elephants, now unopposed by cavalry, turned their full attention to the Arab foot soldiers. The Howdah archers rained down a concentrated barrage of arrows from an elevated position that no shield formation could fully protect against. Simultaneously, the dedicated elephant escort infantry pressed in behind the beasts, using the animal bulk as a moving fortification. And then the elephants themselves made physical contact with the Muslim shield wall. What the classical sources struggle to adequately convey is the sheer, raw physics of an armored war elephant striking a line of human beings. These animals weigh between 4 and 6 tons. Moving at even a moderate pace, they carry a kinetic energy that no human formation can absorb. Men were not simply knocked down. They were hurled through the air, crushed underfoot, tossed by trunks, and driven into each other by the compressing forward momentum of the beast. The Bajila lines were not fighting an enemy, they were fighting gravity. From the roof of Qasr al-Ubaid, Saad ibn Abi Waqqas watched the right wing collapsing in real time. Fighting through his physical torment with the cold mathematical discipline of a supreme commander, he made his assessment in seconds. If the Bajila broke completely, the Sassanids would roll up the entire right flank. The battle would be over on day one. He reached for his pen. The dispatch went to Benu Asad, the tribal contingent positioned immediately to the left of the Bajila. Saad's adjutant read the order aloud to their commander. Ya Bani Asad, dafa'u an ikhwanikum min Bajila, fa innahum yuqtalun. O sons of Asad, defend your brothers from Bajila, for they are being killed. The commander who received this order was one of the most psychologically complex figures on the entire battlefield. Tulayha bin Khuwaylid al-Asti, the former rebel prophet of the Ridda Wars, now fighting under the banner of the caliphate he had once defied. Whether one accepts the theological framing or the purely military reading, the facts recorded in the classical sources are consistent. He was extraordinarily effective. He drew his sword, roared the advance, and the Benu Asad left their own position dangerously weakened and surged laterally across the battlefield into the grinding destruction of the elephant assault zone. What the Benu Asad did in the next 2 hours was, by any military standard, remarkable. Unable to use cavalry, they fought entirely on foot. They threw javelins at the mahouts, the elephant drivers perched on the animals' necks, targeting the unarmored men controlling the beasts. They hacked at the elephants' trunks with heavy swords, provoking the animals to recoil. They absorbed the Howdah arrow fire at close range, men falling constantly, pressing forward to prevent the beasts from achieving the sustained momentum that would complete the destruction of the Bajila. The casualties among the Benu Asad were severe, but they held, and they had bought Saad the critical time he needed. Saad's second dispatch of the day went to the warriors of Banu Tamim. The Tamimi tribesmen were renowned throughout the Arabian Peninsula for exceptional accuracy with the composite bow and an almost preternatural tactical adaptability. Saad's order was precise and specific: target the mahouts and cut the girths, the thick hemp and leather ropes securing the howdahs to the backs of the elephants. The Banu Tamim deployed in a concentrated firing line. Their archers drew their composite bows and elevated their angle, targeting not the heavily armored bodies of the beasts, which had proven essentially impervious to Arab arrows, but the howdah archers in the towers and the exposed mahouts on the necks. Persian riders began to drop. The elevated, coordinated fire from the Muslim archers was brutally accurate, and the howdah archers, however elite, were shooting from a swaying, unstable platform against men on solid ground. Simultaneously, teams of Tamimi infantry executed the second element of the order. Armed with heavy curved blades and an apparently suicidal tolerance for proximity to armored elephants, they sprinted directly beneath the animals' bellies, ducking under the sweeping trunks, and began cutting at the girth ropes from below. The girth ropes snapped. The massive wooden towers, with their armored crews inside, shifted, overbalanced, and toppled violently from the animals' backs. The elite Sassanid howdah archers crashed to the ground and were immediately overwhelmed by the Arab infantry surrounding them. And then the second consequence triggered, equally devastating. The elephants panicked. Deprived of their mahouts, stripped of their towers, maddened by arrow hits and the sensory chaos of close-quarters battle, the great beasts reverted to their most primal response. They turned. They ran. Not toward the Muslims, away from the entire engagement, backward, through the Sassanid ranks. The Sassanid heavy infantry had spent the morning advancing with flawless geometric precision. Nothing in any of their training had prepared them for their own war elephants stampeding directly through their formations from behind. The Persian center shattered. Spear formations dissolved. Men were crushed by the hundreds. The Arab tribes surged forward with a deafening, unified roar. The counter-assault drove deep into the fractured Sassanid center before Rustam's subordinate commanders could restore order. The fighting ground on for the remainder of the daylight hours. Rustam, a professional of the First Order, eventually stabilized his lines. Superior numbers in a grinding infantry engagement are not easily overcome, and the Sassanid formations reorganized, reformed, and pushed back. By the time the sun touched the horizon, both armies had simply run out of the daylight and the physical energy required to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The lines separated. Both sides retreated to their camps. Yom Armath was over. The accounting was grim on both sides. The Arab camp counted its dead in the hundreds. The Benu Asad had paid the heaviest price in the holding action against the elephants. The Bajila losses were also severe, but the critical calculus was this: the Arab lines had held. The elephants had been temporarily neutralized. The Sassanid army had not achieved its primary objective of collapsing the right flank and rolling up the Arab formation. The night of the first day was not a night of rest. It was a night of frantic preparation. Saad, unable to sleep from pain and command anxiety, spent the hours reorganizing his battered contingents, redistributing warriors to fill the gaps left by the day's casualties, and dictating a detailed dispatch to Umar bin al-Khattab in al-Madinah. In the Sassanid camp, Rustam's engineers worked through the darkness by torchlight, repairing the damaged howdahs, re-securing the girths, and preparing the elephant corps for the next day. Both sides knew what the morning would bring. When the Arab warriors emerged from their camps on the morning of the second day, the mood was one that the classical sources describe with unusual psychological precision: grimly resolute. These were not men who had broken. These were men who were counting their dead, binding their wounds, gripping their weapons, and preparing to do it all again. Because there was nowhere to retreat to and nothing behind them worth retreating for. The Sassanid line had reformed in the pre-dawn darkness, and on it, visible in the growing morning light, were the great dark shapes of the war elephants, re-towered, re-armored, their mahouts back in position. Yom Agwath, the day of Agwath, the day of succor. The name was given retrospectively once the events of the day were known. And then, as the morning mist was still clearing from the Atiq Canal, the Arab sentries heard it. Not from the east, where the Sassanid camp flickered with 10,000 fires. From the west, from the deep desert, behind the Arab position. The rhythmic, synchronized drumbeat of approaching cavalry. Scouts galloped toward the sound and returned at full speed. Saad read their dispatches, and for the first time in weeks, something changed in his expression. The Syrian column had arrived. Not the main body, but its vanguard. 1,000 veterans of the Syrian campaign, men who had fought at El Yarmouk, fought and broken the Roman Empire's finest army just months earlier. They had ridden hard across the desert to reach al-Qadisiyyah before the front collapsed. And at their head rode al-Ka'ka ben Amru at-Tamimi. The name al-Ka'ka deserves a moment. He was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary military figures of the 7th century. A warrior of Benu Tamim, he had fought in virtually every major engagement of the Islamic conquests to this point. He was a champion duelist of terrifying speed and aggression. He was a cavalry commander of instinctive, improvisational brilliance. He was a psychologist of warfare who understood that the battle of morale was often more decisive than the battle of bodies. Umar ben al-Khattab had said of him, "The voice of al-Ka'ka in an army is worth more than 1,000 fighters." This was not poetry. It was a cold, strategic assessment of the man's effect on the collective psychology of any force he joined. Al-Ka'ka arrived at the Muslim camp and assessed the tactical situation in minutes. He understood that 1,000 men, even veteran Yarmouk fighters, would not mathematically change the outcome of a battle against 60 to 100,000 Persians. The reinforcement was real, but not large enough to matter in a straightforward military sense. But it could be made to matter in a psychological sense. Al-Ka'ka halted his column just behind the ridgeline, out of direct sight of the Sassanid position. He divided his 1,000 veterans into detachments of 10 men each, and his orders were brief and brilliant. لا تدخلوا معاً أعبروا تل 10 بأعلى الأصوات وأكثر ما يمكن من الغبار وحين تصل 11 لتظهر 10 التالية على الأفق. Do not enter together. Cross the hill 10 by 10 with the loudest voices and as much dust as possible. And when one group of 10 arrives, let the next 10 appear on the horizon. To the Sassanid sentries watching from across the plain, what they saw was not a single, finite column of reinforcements. They saw something far more terrifying, an apparently infinite, unending stream of fresh warriors appearing over the western ridge. A new squad every few minutes, one after another, the western desert apparently disgorging the reserves of an inexhaustible civilization. The effect on already stressed Persian morale, men who had absorbed heavy punishment from the elephant stampede and the Arab counter-assault the previous day, was immediate and deeply corrosive. The question rippling through the Persian ranks was unanswerable. How many are there? Al-Ka'ka understood that the illusion required violent confirmation. The moment he reached the Arab front line, Al-Ka'ka did not stop, did not rest, did not ask for water. He rode his war horse directly into the open ground between the two armies, drew his sword, and raised his voice. He demanded a champion. The Sassanid lines parted, and the man who rode out was not a minor officer sent to test the newcomer. He was one of the most historically significant figures on the entire battlefield. Behmen Jadhawiya. A cold recognition ran through the Muslim lines. Every veteran of the Iraqi campaign knew that name. Behmen Jadhawiya was the Sassanid commander who had directed the Battle of the Bridge, Ma'arakat al-Jisr, the catastrophic engagement where the Muslim army had been destroyed, where thousands had drowned in the Euphrates, where Abu Abid al-Thaqafi had been trampled to death, where Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha had received his mortal wound. This was the man who carried the debt of that disaster on his armored shoulders. Al-Ghaqqar recognized him. He spurred forward. The duel was brutally short. Al-Ghaqqar, fueled by the extraordinary physical momentum of hard riding and the cold, focused grief of an entire civilization's military loss, struck with a speed and precision that bypassed Behmen's guard entirely. Behmen Jadhawiya, victor of the bridge, architect of the Caliphate's worst military disaster, fell dead from his horse into the dust of al-Qadisiyyah. The Arab lines erupted. The ghost of the bridge had been exorcised, publicly, visibly, undeniably, in front of both armies. The Sassanid vanguard visibly wavered. Al-Ghaqqar raised his bloodied sword and signaled the general advance. The fighting of Yom Agwath was distinct from the first day in a critical way. The Sassanid elephants, their girth ropes severed and their howdahs damaged, had been pulled back to the Persian engineering lines for emergency repair. They would not be operational until the following morning. For the entirety of the second day, the Sassanid heavy infantry had to fight without their living fortresses. But Al-Ghaqqar was not satisfied with a straightforward cavalry engagement. The Persian Savaran cataphracts, though shaken, remained a formidable force. He needed to introduce an element of asymmetric chaos into the engagement, something the Persian cavalry's rigid conventional training had not prepared them for. He turned to the Arab supply train. At Al-Ghaqqar's instruction, Muslim warriors gathered the largest available supply camels from the rear encampment. They draped the massive beasts in enormous black tent canvas, covering them from neck to haunches in shapeless, billowing shrouds. They tied hollow gourds and pieces of metal to the trailing edges of the cloth, creating a mobile orchestra of unsettling, alien sound with every movement. The result was a creature that bore no resemblance to anything in the trained visual memory of a Persian warhorse. The Sassanid mounts had been conditioned to charge into walls of spears and through arrow storms. They had been trained to maintain formation through the noise of drums and clashing steel. They were not trained for towering, shapeless black phantoms that rattled and shrieked as they moved. When the Persian cavalry wing launched its charge, Al-Ghaqqar unleashed his draped camels directly into the approaching horses' path. The Sassanid warhorses, bred for conventional warfare, disciplined in every conventional context, ceased to function. They reared, screaming, throwing their heavily armored riders into the ground. They refused the bit entirely. They broke their own formation from within. The Arab light cavalry, entirely unbothered by their own camels, ruthlessly exploited the fractures, cutting deep into the disorganized Sassanid flank and hunting the dismounted cataphracts before they could reform. By the late afternoon, when the main Syrian column, the veterans under Hashim bin Utbah bin Abi Waqqas, crested the western ridge and poured onto the plain in full force, the psychological momentum of the second day belonged entirely to the Caliphate. Yom Agwath ended with the Muslim army ascendant, but veteran commanders do not celebrate after the second day of a 4-day battle. They look toward the enemy camp in the dark, and from the Sassanid lines, in the deep hours of the night, came the sound of hammers and rope and heavy lifting. The elephants were being repaired. Amath, the day of Imath, the day of hardship. The Arab veterans who had fought 2 days of battles against one of history's greatest armies looked across the plain at dawn on the third day and saw the elephants, back, re-towered, re-armored, the mahouts in position. Rostam had learned from 2 days of painful lessons. He did not simply deploy the elephants as before. He restructured their tactical doctrine entirely. This time, the beasts were deployed within a dedicated protective infantry screen, rings of heavy Sassanid infantry explicitly assigned to guard the elephants' legs and flanks, their interlocking shields forming a wall around the base of each animal. The goal was to prevent the Tamimi tribesmen from sliding beneath the beasts to cut the girth ropes. He had also augmented the Howdah crews with additional armored infantrymen, not just archers, but men with shields and long spears to protect the riders from below. It was a significant tactical adaptation. Rostam was a professional, and professionals learn. The Sassanid war drums struck. The entire imperial line advanced. The impact on the Arab center was immediate and severe. The Muslim cavalry was once again neutralized, the horses refusing to advance in the presence of the great beasts. With the Arab cavalry ineffective, the infantry had to absorb the full crushing weight of the Sassanid push alone. The Muslim center began to buckle under the sheer physical mass of the advance. The forward momentum of a force with more physical weight behind it than the Arab lines could easily absorb. From the roof of Qasr al-Ubaid, Saad ibn Abi Waqqas watched his center bowing backward and made his assessment. The protective infantry screen had made girth cutting impossible. The additional Howdah armor had blunted the Mahout targeting archery. The tactical solutions that had worked on day one no longer applied. He required a fundamentally different solution. Saad studied the Sassanid elephant deployment with the systematic eye of a commander looking for structural anchor points, the decision-making nodes that the entire elephant corps oriented toward. He identified 2 animals that stood out from the rest. The largest and most heavily armored beast on the Sassanid left, a pale-colored animal the classical sources call al-Abyad, the white elephant, which appeared to be setting the pace and direction for the left-wing corps, and a battle-scarred veteran on the right, described in the sources as al-Ajreb, the mangy elephant, which served the same function on that wing. The psychology of a war elephant corps had a structural vulnerability. The herd followed the lead animals. Break the leaders, and the followers would break. Saad sent his dispatch. The orders were galloped to al-Ghaqqar ben Amru at-Tamimi and his brother Asim ben Amru at-Tamimi. The order was 5 words: Istahdifu al-ayun waqta'u al-kharatim. Aim for the eyes and cut off the snouts. Al-Ghaqqar and Asim did not delegate this task. They assembled a small elite strike team from the veteran Tamimi fighters, men who had already demonstrated the specific combination of close-quarters courage and disciplined execution required. They dismounted. On foot, against an advancing wall of Sassanid soldiers and armored war elephants, they advanced. To reach al-Abyad, the strike team had to punch through the dedicated infantry screen that Rostam had specifically deployed to prevent this exact action. The Tamimi veterans threw themselves directly at the Sassanid shield wall with the violent, concentrated momentum of men who had consciously accepted their own deaths and freed themselves from the weight of self-preservation. They hit the Persian shields at a run. Men went down on both sides. The Tamimis absorbed the spear thrusts, tore a momentary bleeding gap in the iron wall, and broke through into the shadow of the white elephant. What they experienced in the next 30 seconds has been recorded in the classical chronicles with unusual vividness, because the survivors who described it were clearly affected by the proximity and scale of what they confronted. The white elephant towered above them, its wooden tower blocking the morning sky, arrows raining down from the archers overhead, the ground shaking with each footfall. Al-Ghaqqar and Asim moved together with the synchronized coordination of men who had trained and fought alongside each other for years. They calculated the trajectory upward against a moving target the size of a house. They threw. Both javelins drove into the white elephant's eyes simultaneously. The sound that erupted from the animal was something the classical sources reach for extraordinary language to describe. Not the organized trumpet of a trained war elephant, but a sound of pure, unfiltered biological agony that cut across the roar of the entire battlefield. Men on both sides stopped fighting for a moment. The white elephant reared violently on its hind legs, completely unbalancing the wooden tower. As the massive beast crashed back down, El-Ghakar lunged forward with his heavy sword and severed the animal's trunk. A blinded, trunk-severed war elephant is no longer a weapon. It is a biological disaster. 4 tons of maddened, suffering, completely uncontrollable animal with no capacity to orient itself toward the enemy. On the opposite wing, Asim and his team executed the same maneuver against El-Adreb with equivalent precision. The lead elephants turned. The rest of the corps followed. A chain reaction of pure animal terror swept through all the war elephants simultaneously. They turned as a single maddened herd and stampeded backward through the Sassanid formations. The imperial heavy infantry, which had held its geometric alignment through 3 days of brutal fighting, was annihilated from within by its own supreme weapon. Men were crushed by the hundreds. The Sassanid center, shattered from behind by stampeding elephants and struck from the front by an Arab force surging forward in their wake, dissolved. The elephants did not stop running until they plunged into the waters of the Atik Canal and swam blindly for the eastern shore. They never returned to the battlefield. The destruction of the Elephant Corps should have ended Yawm Amath. In any conventional battle, the loss of the primary battlefield weapon would have precipitated an orderly withdrawal and a renegotiated position the following morning. But something different happened as the sun went down on the 3rd day of al-Qadisiyyah. The destruction of the elephants had fired the Arab tribes with a momentum that could not simply be switched off at sunset. They were winning. They could feel it. And every moment of darkness that passed was a moment Rostam could use to rebuild his position. On the Persian side, the loss of the elephants had triggered the desperate, feral ferocity of an army that has lost its primary technological advantage and is beginning to sense its own mortality. Neither side could stop. As the last light vanished from the Iraqi sky, the battle did not pause. It continued. The commands of both supreme commanders became irrelevant. There were no banners visible in the dark. There were no rallying cries that could carry over the roar of 60,000 men fighting in absolute blackness. There were no tactical maneuvers, no flanking charges, no coordinated surges. There were only 2 men in the dark, finding each other by the sound of breathing and fighting to the death with shattered swords and broken spears. The classical chroniclers, men who had interviewed survivors, gave up trying to describe what happened tactically during the night. They could only describe the sound. It was not the organized war cries of armies. It was a continuous, low, terrifying roar, clashing steel and dying screams, and the primal, exhausted howling of tens of thousands of men operating at the absolute outer limit of what human bodies can endure. Yawm Amath had ended. Laylat al-Harir, the night of clamor, the night of howling, had begun. There is a threshold in human endurance. It is not the threshold of courage. Courage is required before the threshold. This is what lies beyond courage, the place where survival instinct itself begins to fail, where the body runs out of the biochemical reserves that sustain even the most basic fight or flight response, where men collapse not from wounds, but from the simple terminal exhaustion of their own hearts. Both armies at al-Qadisiyyah crossed that threshold sometime in the deep, cold hours before the pre-dawn of the 4th day. For approximately 12 uninterrupted hours, from the fall of darkness to the first grey light, they fought, in absolute blindness, in the freezing mud of the Iraqi plain, without sleep, without water in any organized sense, without food, without the ability to orient themselves except by the sound of enemy breathing and the weight of an enemy blade. Men fought until their swords snapped, and then fought with the broken hilts, When weapons were lost entirely, they wrestled in the mud. The classical sources record, and this is not rhetorical excess, but clinical observation from primary testimony, that men died of pure physical exhaustion during Laylat al-Harir, not from wounds. Their hearts stopped. In the deepest, coldest hour before the pre-dawn, the moment that military psychology, across all cultures and eras, identifies as the nadir of human willpower, al-Ka'ka ben Amru Tamimi, covered in the blood of 3 days of combat and 12 hours of nocturnal melee, did something that the classical sources record as one of the defining moments of the entire battle. He rode through the darkness among the remnants of Benu Tamim. He did not appeal to religion. He did not appeal to tribal honor. He made a cold, military argument that every exhausted man around him could understand. An-nasru liman sabar, isbiru sa'atan wahida, inna al-aduwa yu'ani mimma tu'anunu tamaman, fa in darabtum al-an inkasir. Victory belongs to those who endure for just 1 hour. The enemy is suffering exactly as you are, so if you strike now, they will be broken. The Tamimis moved. The surrounding contingents, hearing the Tamimis surge through the noise of Laylat al-Harir, reacted with the cascading momentum of men who had nothing left except each other's example. The warriors of An-Nakha moved. The survivors of Asad moved. The veterans from Al-Yemen, min al-Hijaz, were min Thughur al-Iraq. The entire Arab line threw its collective remaining weight into a single coordinated pre-dawn offensive in the dark. Yawm al-Qadisiyyah, the day of al-Qadisiyyah, the 4th day, the last day. As the first pale light bled over the eastern horizon, it illuminated a battlefield that defied the vocabulary of military description. The plain of al-Qadisiyyah was a landscape of apocalyptic carnage. Tens of thousands of dead and wounded from 3 days and a night of continuous fighting, churned into mud and the wreckage of weapons and armor and the detritus of an empire's last stand. And visible in that grey dawn light, the Sassanid heavy infantry, the institutional core of the Persian Empire's military power, was buckling. After more than 30 hours of continuous, unrelenting pressure, the geometric alignment that had defined Persian military supremacy for centuries was visibly failing. The center was bowing backward toward the Atig Canal. The flanks were compromised. The reserve lines had been feeding into the main engagement for hours with nothing to show for it. Rostam could see it from his throne, and then the weather decided. A sudden violent western sandstorm, the seasonal Sabar wind, ripped across the plain of Al-Qadisiyyah from the Muslim side. The classical sources are explicit about this. It was not a gentle squall. It was a full, savage gale that picked up thousands of tons of Iraqi dust and drove it horizontally with tremendous force directly into the face of the Sassanid army. The Arab tribesmen had the wind at their backs. The Persians were suddenly blind, completely, suffocatingly blind, in a torrent of choking sand that made breathing itself difficult. Rustam's command post, with its magnificent imperial canopy and the great Derafsh Kawiyani flying overhead, took the full force of the gale. With a sound described in the chronicles as a violent crack, audible even over the roar of battle, the gale tore the canopy from its moorings and ripped it through the air. The heavy imperial tent canopy tumbled into the wind and blew into the churning waters of the Atig Canal behind the Persian lines. The visual collapse of the Supreme Commander's canopy was the final psychological straw. The Arab vanguard, seeing the symbol of Sassanid imperial authority destroyed before their eyes, launched the breakthrough offensive. They punched through the blinded, exhausted Sassanid center and drove directly into the imperial command camp. Rostam Farrokhzad, seeing his center disintegrate, his canopy destroyed, his army dissolving around him, abandoned his throne, his standard, his command, and fled. The supreme commander of the Sassanid war machine, heavily armored and bleeding from multiple wounds, moved through the chaos of the sandstorm and the breaching Arab vanguard, and attempted to hide among a train of baggage mules near the canal bank. What happened next is recorded in At-Tabari with notable specificity in the tradition preserved from early sources. A warrior of Benu Tamim, Hilal bin Alqmat at-Timi, according to the most frequently cited tradition in At-Tabari, was cutting through the Sassanid command camp when he located Rostam in the chaos near the canal. There was no grand duel. There was no exchange of words. Rostam threw himself toward the Atig Canal, desperate to swim to the eastern shore. Hilal pursued him into the shallows, plunged through the reeds, dragged the Sassanid commander back from the water, and delivered the killing blow. He stood upright in the blinding sandstorm, covered in mud and the blood of an empire. He climbed onto Rustam's empty, abandoned throne. His voice cut through the roar of the storm. "Wa Rabbil Kaaba qataltu Rustam, ilayya, halumma ilayya." "By the Lord of the Kaaba, I have killed Rostam. To me, come to me." The head of Rostam Farrokhzad was raised above the battlefield. At that exact moment, the Derafsh Kawiyani, the sacred royal standard that had led Persian armies to victory for 5 centuries, woven from the skin of the legendary blacksmith carver and set with rubies and gold of extraordinary value, was captured by the Arab vanguard and pulled from its staff. The psychological decapitation of the Sassanid army was instantaneous and total. The imperial formations, which had fought with genuinely extraordinary courage and discipline for 4 days, ceased to exist as coherent military units. Not because the men were cowards, because the symbolic infrastructure that made an imperial army out of 60 to 100,000 individuals had been simultaneously destroyed. Panic swept through the Persian host like a physical wave. An enormous army became a blind, stampeding mob. The Arab cavalry, freed from the terror of the elephants and unleashed onto a broken, fleeing enemy, fell upon the retreating Sassanid columns with the merciless efficiency of men who understood that victory was not secured until the enemy could no longer reorganize. The slaughter at the canal and the pontoon bridges was catastrophic. Sassanid cataphracts, weighed down by heavy lamellar armor that had made them invincible on the open battlefield, drowned by the hundreds in the Atig channels, unable to swim in their equipment. Regiments bottlenecked at the bridges and were cut down from behind. The Sassanid wing commander, Jalinus, attempting to maintain a rearguard action and preserve some organized withdrawal, was hunted down and killed by the Arab cavalry. The left-wing commander, Mehran bin Behram Arazi, also fell in the rout. By the time the sandstorm finally settled and the afternoon sun of the 4th day burned through the haze, the Sassanid expeditionary force, the greatest, most technologically sophisticated, most heavily armored army the Persian Empire could field, had been utterly and completely destroyed. Saad ibn Abi Waqqas lay on the roof of Qasr al-Ubaid and listened to the silence that had replaced Laylat al-Hirir. After 4 days of continuous apocalyptic violence, the plain of al-Qadisiyyah was quiet. Quiet in the specific, terrible way that only a battlefield can be quiet. A silence populated by the sounds of dying men and torchlight moving through the carnage. The casualty figures that emerge from the classical sources require careful handling. At-Tabari, al-Baladheri, and the later chronicle tradition offer varying figures, and modern historians work with ranges rather than precise counts. What the sources agree on is the rough proportion. The Muslim army lost somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 dead out of a fighting force of approximately 30,000, a casualty rate that indicates the genuine ferocity and closeness of the engagement. The Sassanid losses are essentially impossible to accurately count. Estimates range from 20,000 to over 50,000 dead. The highest classical claims suggest nearly 30,000 Persian soldiers drowned or were killed while attempting to retreat across the chain bridge and river. The directional truth is clear. The Sassanid expeditionary force was destroyed as an operational entity, not weakened, not depleted, destroyed. Saad understood precisely what the dead had purchased. He dictated his dispatch to Medina. When the courier reached Umar bin al-Khattab, the Caliph reportedly wept. He then issued the orders that would reshape the ancient world. The Arab army was to advance, not to raid, to take. The Battle of Al-Qadisiyyah was not merely a military victory. It was a civilizational inflection point. The agricultural heartland of Iraq, as-Sawad, the richly irrigated black soil territory that had been the economic engine of the Persian Empire for centuries, was now open. The frontier fortifications were unmanned. The reserve armies were dissolved. The provincial governors had no forces to call upon. And sitting exposed, undefended, a matter of weeks' march to the northeast, was Al-Madain, Ctesiphon, the imperial capital, the throne room of the King of Kings. The world's most ancient surviving empire had just lost its ability to defend its own front door. The storm of Qadisiyah has settled, but the campaign of Iraq reaches its ultimate, grueling crescendo. The remnants of the Persian command have fled east, desperate to fortify the monumental walls of the imperial capital. But the Rashidun army is no longer a desert levy. It is a battle-hardened siege force. In our next episode, Episode 7, The Siege of Bahurashir, we march directly on the imperial capital. We will break down the grueling, mud-soaked slog through the Mesopotamian orchards, the mechanical nightmare of siege warfare, and the desperate, suicidal Sassanid attempt to hold the river line against a force that has already drowned its own fears. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our march on capital.